Tonight, aftermath of the unthinkable. Americans struggle to count the terrible cost of what the president calls acts of war and contemplate what comes next. Good evening, I'm Larry King, and this is a special edition of Larry King Live. We'll be with you, of course, for the full hour and then more special reports throughout the 24-hour period that we cover it on CNN. Before we meet all of our guests, let's start with the newest member of the CNN family, Paula Zahn in New York. Paula, can you give us an update as to how things stand now and what's happening with that third building?
Absolutely, Larry. There is a lot to talk about tonight on a lot of different fronts. For starters, I'm going to bring you up to date on what the administration is planning to do. They are certainly laying the groundwork for a strong military response, reaching to allies across the world in the aftermath of what you just said President Bush called an act of war. Secretary of State Colin Powell told me earlier today this will not be over in a week or two. It will be a full-scale assault, not just by the United States, but what he called the whole civilized community. Now, there's some interesting information that came out of the White House today. Press Secretary Ari Fleischer now confirming that the United States has real and credible evidence that that one plane that slammed into the Pentagon was actually intended to fly to hit the White House. Also, Mr. Fleischer says Air Force One was supposed to have been a target too. That is why the president, who was in Florida at the time of these multiple attacks, was not immediately flown back to Washington, D.C. On the congressional front, the House and Senate have each passed a resolution condemning Tuesday's attacks. The chairman of the House Appropriations Committee is confirming that Congress will move quickly to pass or appropriate some $20 billion earmarked for rescue efforts, repairs, and counterterrorism efforts. The money will go obviously to federal, state, and local agencies involved in the cleanup, Larry. Meanwhile, the investigation is actually expanding in a number of different ways tonight.
Yeah, we're going to be covering that through the hour. I did want to ask you, Paula, about that building that was sort of coming down. What happened to it?
Well, here in New York City, we're keeping an eye on 3 or 4 buildings that are seriously degraded. There is a 54-story tower that now is partially collapsed, which sat across from what used to be the World Trade Center. There are 2 hotels in the area that have strong structural problems. They may go. Now, this further complicates rescue efforts here. As you know, Larry, about the only good news to come out of the city today is that rescuers were able to successfully rescue 11 folks trapped in the rubble. That included 6 firefighters, 3 police officers, and I think what the city is having the toughest time wrestling with right now is the tremendous scale of loss here. The mayor, Larry, telling us earlier today the numbers are going to be horrific. Yeah. He expects it to be several thousand in each towers. And as you know, having lived here before, I think the news that has left New Yorkers the most numb is that New York City lost its fire chief, its deputy fire chief, as well as 300 firefighters and well over 80 police officers. And time, as you know, Larry, isn't benefiting anyone. You know that within the first 24 hours of one of these catastrophes, that is your chance to rescue people alive. But there is still hope.
We'll see you in an hour with Aaron Brown on a CNN special report. Thanks for joining us and welcome aboard.
Thank you. Glad to be a part of your team.
Paula Zahn. She'll be back in an hour. Now let's stay in New York and meet Captain Kenneth Erb of the New York City Fire Department. He's captain of the firehouse at West 31st Street. His firehouse lost 3 firefighters yesterday, and he also lost a longtime friend, Father Michael Judge, the fire chaplain for the New York City Fire Department. And with Captain Erb is firefighter James Grillo of the New York City Fire Department. As you can see, some injuries suffered. He was in the South Tower when it went down and lost several of his firefighter friends. Mr. Grillo, James, what was it like when you got there?
It was terror, sheer terror. Bodies were falling out of the sky. They were jumping off the 105th floor and they were landing all over the street and the sidewalk. There was fear in everybody's eyes.
You also saw people jumping out of buildings, right?
Yes, they were jumping out from everywhere from the 70th floor above. It was horrible.
And what were you doing?
I was trying to avoid looking up and watching it, Mr. King. It was horrible. I saw dozens of people jumping.
Now, how did you get hurt, James?
I was my assignment with Latitude 4, the company I'm assigned to, we were supposed to go into building number 2, the South Tower, and make our way into tower number 1, the North Tower. And we were caught in the collapse in the lobby of tower number 2, the South Tower.
Boy. Captain Erb, I know you didn't go to the scene, right? Captain, is that true?
No, I wasn't working that day. I came in on a recall.
So you were off and they brought you in?
They had a recall for all police officers and fire officers. As soon as the news struck, the media gave that announcement, and we all, one way or the other, got in through hitchhiking, get in your car or whatever.
You lost, what, 3 firefighters from the station on West 31st Street?
We did. We lost a firefighter, a lieutenant, and a captain.
And are you the one that has to inform the nearest relative?
I went out with another former captain last night. Normally, in this circumstance, Father Michael Judge would be helping us out with this, but of course he passed away and he couldn't do it. So it's so chaotic. There was really, we had to make our own procedures. So me and a Chief Keys, who used to be a member of Latitude 4, we went and got a former retired battalion chief who is a deacon in the Catholic Church, and we informed the family of the lieutenant and my fellow captain. We informed their families that they were gone.
There's no training for that, is there, Captain?
No, not to my knowledge.
Did you lose any friends, Jimmy Grillo?
I lost very many friends, quite a few friends, personal friends. And the fire department's made up, everybody's a friend in the fire department, thousands of men, we're all friends. But personally, I've lost quite a few, maybe a dozen personal friends. And it breaks my heart. They're great men. They're very great men.
James, after something
men with
like
families, men that have babies on the way, men that are husbands, new homeowners. It's tragic.
And after something like this, James, do you ever think of maybe not being a fireman anymore?
I'll be a fireman at least for another 20 years.
So no thought of
I will always
leaving
be
that
a fireman.
job?
No, Mr. King, I will always be a fireman here in New York City, protecting the people of New York and my friends.
Captain, what can you tell us about the late Father Michael Judge?
Oh, I can tell you a great many things. He was a great man. He was very close to the members of Engine 1 and Latitude 4. He's stationed at St. Francis across the street from our house. He kept his car in the house. He stopped and talked to us every night. He was not only our spiritual leader, but he was a very good friend to us and a father figure somewhat. I mean, there are things that I would talk to him about that maybe I would only talk to my own father about.
I think we can hear some words from the father. Can we hear that, crew? Listen.
Some of the people that we lost, we saw, like Father Judge and Chief Gansey, Bill Feehan. We saw them about 10 minutes before we went over to 75 Barclay Street. And as I talked to their families, and I explained to them that they were working very hard and they were working at what they love to do. And I'm sure their efforts will end up having saved other lives.
And joining us as well is Jesse Blumenthal of St. Vincent's Hospital in New York. And Jesse, I understand you, did you work on the, doctor, did you work on the priest?
Well, no, I had taken care of the priest previously. He had been a patient of mine. I knew him, and everything he said about him, he was really an outstanding gentleman.
And what did he die from?
Well, no, I did not take care of him at this time. I said I've taken care of him in the past.
And what kind of person was he?
Oh, he was a very warm, outgoing man, a delightful man.
What's the situation like at the hospital?
Well, right now things have quieted down, and we're obviously, quite dismayed at the lack of patients that we've had. There was an initial frenzy. We've seen over 370 patients yesterday, and unfortunately, after about 1 o'clock this morning, they've just been unable to extricate anybody, and of course the assumption is that there are very few survivors. We have taken a few people out, but certainly we know that the vast majority of people in the building have not survived.
Thank you, Jesse, and thank you, Captain Erb and Firefighter Grillo. We salute you all. Joining us now from Washington is Dr. Bernadine Healy. She is President and CEO of the American Red Cross, the 20th person to lead that nation's foremost, this nation's foremost humanitarian organization. What's the latest information you have on the need for blood?
Well, Americans have responded with great compassion and with every bit that they can offer with regard to our need for blood. Larry, we have had blood drives all over this country. They're expanded. Our entire Red Cross headquarters has been turned into one huge giant field hospital. People coming in and giving blood, waiting in some cases for 5-6 hours. Every time we say, we're sorry it's taking this long, and they say, we want to be here. It's almost become a chapel. People are coming there to give blood, to mourn, to hold hands, and to do the one thing that they think they can do, that they know they can do, as a statement of their solidarity, of their devotion, of their defiance of this hideous terrorism and the life that have been lost and the fear that has been instilled in every American because of it.
And, Doctor, do you have Red Cross volunteers at the scene now?
Yes, we have in New York, of course. We have over 400, 500 volunteers that have been working round the clock since yesterday. We also have volunteers out at the Pentagon site. We provide their help and food, relief, cots to the rescue workers, those heroes that you've been talking about, Larry. We're also there to help with the families of the victims at all of the sites, Boston, Los Angeles, San Francisco, because Pennsylvania, because whenever there's an air crash, the Red Cross is there. You know, we deal, one big air crash is an enormous proportion. Here we're seeing 4 air crashes in one day.
How could you could certainly not have planned for this.
We cannot plan for this, but for the past year we've been working intensely with the federal government under the Federal Response Plan for Weapons of Mass Destruction, and what we have seen is a commercial airliner filled with human beings turned into a weapon of mass destruction.
What's the #1 need now?
The number need now is to, across the country, is going to be grief counseling. It's going to be people reaching out to try and understand this. This is, of course, about these victims who are hideously harmed and damaged, but it's about every American who is mourning today. It is about every American who has been terrified by what they've seen. It's the children across this country. And the American Red Cross is working with the Department of Health and Human Services, Secretary Thompson, to see that in all of our chapters around the country we will be providing grief counseling for people of all ages to help them through what will be a very difficult time ahead. You know, Larry, we know from our work in disasters that mourning goes on. We know that people go into very susceptible to depression, susceptible to sadness of the highest kind, and people listening tonight are going to feel it too.
Thank you, Dr. Healy. We'll be seeing you again soon. Dr. Bernadine Healy. We go now to Fort Myers, Florida. Rudy Deckers joins us. He's the owner of Huffman Aviation International. The FBI has talked to Rudy about a possible suspect. Reports that 2 of the bombing suspects may have attended his school. Is that what they talked to you about, Rudy?
Yes, that's correct. They called us. They came by at 2:45 a.m. last night, and they got from my managers several files about these students. And during the day, we found a lot more about these students. They've been with us from July till October, November last year, and obtained the first licenses they needed to fly.
So this was their initial training as pilots, right?
Yeah, it's an initial training. They came walking into the door, checked our facility, and choose to fly with us. And in November, apparently, that's what we heard and learned today, they went to other flight school to obtain jet training. We do not provide jet training. The training we provide as Huffman Aviation in Venice is solely for small planes.
Were they of a nationality other than American?
No, they were, my people took copies of their passports when they came in because they need to show an ID. And apparently one of them was in Afghanistan, and I don't know what the other one was. I don't see the files myself because I have my managers taking care of that. I have spoken with one of them in several occasions, and Mr. Atta, I spoke to him one time, 5 minutes.
That's Mohammed Atta, right?
Mohammed Atta, that's correct.
And he was one of the two. Were they good pilots?
I have checked today with the instructor and with the examiner who did the flight test, and they were average pilots.
Average. They had to go on to, now with your training, they couldn't go on and fly a 757 or a 767, so they go on to jet school.
Yeah,
were you shocked by all of this? Did they ever look did you ever have any inkling that these people might be involved? And again, this is all just conjecture. We don't know that they were the pilots on any of these planes.
No,
what do you make of it?
Well, I was shocked yesterday when it happened in the United States with the tragedy. Today, it was at my doorstep and not 2,000 miles away. We were in shock, and we're still in shock. We had no knowledge, of course. None of my people, I have 48 employees in Venice. None of them had any idea, of course. It's unbelievable. The feeling we have is undescribable. It's terrible.
Now, Rudy, if they were involved, they had been planning this for a long time.
Well, yeah, the first day when we saw what happened, we thought, you know, like every other American, would this be planned a long time ahead, et cetera, et cetera. We know now that they were flying with us from July to November. And after our flight school, they went to another flight school, so they've been planning this quite a while.
In the questioning, did the FBI give you an indication that they were strong suspects?
They did not spoke to me about the questioning because that happened at 2:30, 2:40 a.m. this morning, and they called me at 7 o'clock this morning. I briefly talked to the FBI when they're ready to leave the office, and they indicated to my employees that they thought that these were prime suspects. Yes, sir.
I guess in your life of training people to be pilots, you never thought that you would have people use you to go on to do terroristic acts.
No, you don't think about that. We do all the necessary work to know who customers are. We have a lot of foreign students coming over. These people were foreigners, but they came over directly in the front door. They said they've been flying with other flight schools in the United States. They were not happy. Choose our school to finalize their training.
Rudy, thank you. I know how tough this must be for you. Rudy Deckers, the owner of Huffman Aviation International.
Thank you.
We meet now, thank you. Three experts on the subject of terrorism. Here now in Los Angeles is Brian Jenkins. He returns again. He's a consultant to governments and private sector, senior advisor to the president of the RAND Corporation. In Washington is Christopher Whitcomb, FBI supervisory special agent, a former member of the elite FBI hostage rescue team, and author of a terrific book, Cold Zero, Inside the FBI Hostage Rescue Team. Also in Washington is Peter Bergen, CNN's terrorism analyst who was working on a book about Osama bin Laden and interviewed bin Laden 4 years ago. Brian, what do you make first of this Boston thing today?
Well, I think we're going to...
SWAT teams going in and...
I think we're going to see a very, very quick action, as I mentioned yesterday. An operation of this size is going to leave a lot of footprints, a lot of fingerprints, a lot of clues. And the action in Boston we saw today, the revelations about the flight school that we just saw repeated now, are the kind of information that we are going to see developing over the next several days. So I think the investigation will move very, very quickly, at least insofar as identifying the actual participants in the attack.
Christopher, if it gets to the point as we have promised that we will take them out, we will rid them from this planet in a sense, we are at war with them, how do you do that, Christopher? How do you take out a bin Laden or someone like a bin Laden who's hidden, who moves around, and who may be under cover of the country he lives in?
Well, I don't know about taking him out, Larry, but I think we have a lot of options. One of them obviously is military. The other, because this is a law enforcement operation and because we have to go with the justice system, and we want to bring ultimately these people to justice. We've done in the past operations which are referred to as renditions, where we go into other countries with the cooperation of those countries, of course, and bring people back to the United States.
Yeah. The public, though, I think 94% of the public, Christopher, wants us to go in somewhere and do something. Do you understand that?
No, I understand it's a very reasonable thing to want to bring these people to justice, but I want to point out that we've done this in the past, going way back to the mid-'80s with Fawaz Yunus, who was an aircraft hijacker, and moving through the 90s with people like Emil Khanzi and Ramzi Youssef, people like that, that we've reached out to these people in foreign countries and brought them back to the United States. We've done this in the past, and there's no doubt in my mind that we'll find these people and we'll bring them back one way or another.
Peter, what can you tell us briefly about bin Laden? What is he like?
When I met him in '97, he spoke in a very mild-mannered way. He was somewhat polite. He bears himself in a slightly haughty manner. But he delivered his words of rage against the United States, and the words were full of rage, but the manner was very mild. Just going to your point about if bin Laden is in fact behind all these attacks, an operation, as Mr. Whitcomb referred to go in and perhaps snatch him, as was the case with Ramzi Youssef and the World Trade Center bombing, this would be an order of magnitude very different, because unlike Ramzi Youssef, who was essentially operating by himself and there was a $2 million reward on his head, Osama bin Laden is surrounded by dozens of battle-hardened veterans who are intimately familiar with the rocky, difficult terrain of Afghanistan. It would be a very, very messy operation to go in and either snatch him or even attempt to kill him. I think the United States has considered this in the past and dismissed it in '98.
Brian, could you, well, I guess the public would look at this simply, could you bomb him out?
I don't know that you could bomb him out. I mean, I think that the magnitude of this operation is going to call for a qualitatively different response than we have seen in the past to acts of terrorism. The shock that's turning to grief, that will soon turn to anger on the part of the American people, is going to demand something more than a salvo of cruise missiles. I think really what the administration is going to be building toward is more of a sustained campaign, a sustained series of operations that will involve both diplomacy and military operations designed to create an environment that will ultimately allow us to go in and, if indeed it turns out to be Osama bin Laden, then to attempt to capture or to deal with him in another way.
Now, what do you... Christopher, in the last chapter of your book, you say crisis resolution has become an art in this country, and that's good because terrorism is coming. You don't need an army to lay siege to a country anymore. Obviously, we saw that yesterday. What can you do about it? Christopher.
Well, it's a complicated issue, Larry. I wrote that because we're talking about terrorism being spread by the media, and I talk about all you're needing is a pipe bomb and some good air coverage. We've gone way beyond that in the past couple days to an extraordinary attack on the country. But I think what we have now is a unique opportunity to bring all the resources of the United States together. We need the political will of the people and the elected officials, obviously, to do something here. But this is an aspect for the military, an aspect for the intelligence community, and for law enforcement, and really need to bring all of those together to go after them. I agree completely that this is going to be very difficult to go into Afghanistan, but there are some avenues we can pursue.
Peter Bergen, what do you think about the information we learned that one of these planes, the plane apparently that left Dulles, was going to go to the White House, or maybe Air Force One?
Well, I mean, that is what's being reported. Clearly, the White House is the ultimate symbol. Bin Laden's people are very interested in attacking symbols of United States government, whether it's embassies or warships or symbols of America's economic might, as in the World Trade Center, it appears. So clearly it makes sense. These people operate on symbols. They're very interested in anniversaries. The anniversary of the introduction of U.S. troops in Saudi Arabia was the occasion 8 years later for the bombing of the U.S. embassies in Africa. So I think it makes sense that it might be related to bin Laden in that sense.
Brian, finally we're going to see more than less?
More, I think...
acts?
I think we have to. I think we have to assume that possibility. That's not a prediction, but certainly as we mobilize to respond, there
assume the
will.
worst.
Beg pardon?
Assume the worst.
I think we have to assume that there will be more attacks. They may not be on this scale because this was months in the planning, but we cannot presume that we will be able to engage in a worldwide combat against a terrorist network, a series of terrorist networks, and have immunity in this country. It was demonstrated. We don't have it yesterday. It can be demonstrated again.
No. Thank you. Thank you, gentlemen. Thank you all. Here's a brief note of what was said by President Bush earlier today, and then we'll meet our next guest. Watch.
The deliberate and deadly attacks which were carried out yesterday against our country were more than acts of terror. They were acts of war. This will require our country to unite in steadfast determination and resolve. Freedom and democracy are under attack.
We're back. We're joined now in Saratoga, California, by Alice Hoagland. Her son, Mark Bingham, called her from the hijacked United Airlines Flight 93 that left Newark and crashed in Pennsylvania. There you see his picture. In New York is Laura Van Auken. Her husband, Kenneth, is missing. He was working on the 102nd floor of the World Trade Center North Tower. In New York at St. Vincent's Hospital are Karen Wiley and Michael Rossweiler. They are searching for their missing father, Roger Mark Rossweiler. And also in New York is Gil Baker, the New Yorker who helped out after the bombing and later managed to shoot home video of that rescue effort. We'll start with Alice Hoagland. Your son was on the plane. He called you and said what, Alice?
He said, I just want to let you know that I love you all. There are 3 men on board who have taken over the aircraft, and they say they have a bomb. And at that point, we were cut off. He wasn't able to say anything else. The conversation lasted about a minute. He was very intent on telling us that he loved us, trying to impart other information, but he was thwarted in that.
Alice, you are a flight attendant for that airline?
Yes, I am. I'm a flight attendant for United Airlines based in San Francisco, as is my sister, Candace. Mark was flying on Candy's companion pass. That's Candy on the right there. It's Mark in the middle of me on the left.
Now, later we would learn from another passenger calling that the men on that plane apparently, from what we've learned, attacked the hijackers, and that would probably the cause of it going down in Pennsylvania and not in Washington somewhere, so that you and your son and the others were heroes. How did you feel upon learning that?
Well, it's no surprise to us. We know that Mark is a very take-charge sort of guy. He doesn't back away from a fight. He is very hands-on. He is wonderful in a clinch. I know that he was seated in seat 4D, which is up in first class, so he was very visible to these hijackers, and he was also close to them. And it is very likely that he participated, if he was at all able, in that attempted intervention in the last there. And yes, indeed, if that is the case, then those brave people that did that were successful in saving the lives of many hundreds of people on the ground, and we take a lot of comfort in that.
You should. Alice, thank you. Laura Van Auken is in New York. Her husband, Kenneth, is missing. He was working on the 102nd floor. What does he do, Laura?
He works for Cantor Fitzgerald, and he's a bond broker. And he was on the 102nd floor, and we just haven't heard anything at all.
Did you talk to him at all? Did he call home?
He called home. He left a message, and that's the last I heard from him.
That message was left on your answering machine?
Yes, it was.
Yeah. Let's listen to the voice of Kenneth Van Auken calling home.
I love you. I'm in the World Trade Center. The building was hit by something. I don't know if I'm going to get out, but I love you very much. I hope I'll see you later. Bye.
Boy, Laura, what must it be like to hear that?
It was just horrible. It was really just horrible. I could hear the terror in his voice, and he was trying to sound like he was calm for us, but you could hear the chaos in the background and the terror in his voice.
You have children, Laura?
I do. I have 2 children. My son is 14, Matthew, and my daughter is 12. Her name is Sarah.
How are they handling this?
Oh, Sarah's a mess. She's goes in waves with hysterical crying and back and forth. And Matthew is in some denial, I think, but you know, he's obviously beginning to see that, you know, his dad's not contacted us yet, so we're waiting.
Laura, did you get the message before you had turned on the television to see what was happening, or after?
Before. I got the message before I turned on the television, and turned on the television right away and realized it was a plane and that hit the building, and of course thought it was just an accident at first, and then saw the other plane hit the other building and realized that it was a terrorist attack.
Laura, our prayers and thoughts are with you.
Thank you.
Karen Wiley and Michael Rossweiler are at St. Vincent's Hospital searching for their missing father, Roger Mark Rossweiler. Karen, what was he do? Was he in, which tower was he in?
He was in Tower 1, and he was on the 100th floor. And we know he was there because a coworker of his had received a voicemail from him at 8:40 asking him to go to lunch. We haven't heard anything else except we had gotten a fax. My mom and my sister at home got a fax saying that, from somebody in the Coast Guard, saying that an unidentified male, John Doe, was admitted to a burn unit, matching his full description down to his back surgery. And we're not sure if it was a false lead or just trying to keep the hope and just hoping that that was him, or that he's somewhere and we can find him. We've been passing out flyers all.
I see that. Michael, where was he admitted? Where was this John Doe admitted to a burn center? Where?
We don't know. We heard the fax said that he was sent to Jefferson Hospital, and we talked to a bunch of people on the street, and nobody has heard from it or heard about the hospital. And then later on, we got some news that he was shipped to Canada. So we have no further information.
Karen, do you know what hospital in Canada the John Doe was sent to?
They didn't know. Our family was trying to call, and they don't seem to be having any luck right now finding a John Doe anywhere. So
well, maybe we can help. If someone watching in Canada or somewhere knows about a John Doe who had burns from that tragedy, there's a number you can call. It's 908-782-4986. That's 908-782-4986. Karen and Michael, I sure hope you find Mark.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Roger Mark Rossweiler. The number again, 908-782-4986. Let's check in with Gil Baker, the New Yorker who helped out after the bombing. Where were you, Gil?
Well, I began the day just north of Houston Street, which was some distance from the World Trade Center, directing traffic at an intersection. The NYPD directed me to go to an intersection that needed some supervision and didn't have any officers. So I was at an intersection there for an hour or so, and then they were calling for help at a triage setup center that they were putting together at Northmore and Greenwich. And so I went over there and ended up ultimately directing traffic for 7 hours.
And this is a video you took, right? The video we're seeing now is video you took.
Yeah, it is.
How did you think of doing that?
Well, I worked 13 hours as a volunteer, and at the end of that period of time, I was tired but still enervated, and thought it would be a good idea to capture the heroics, basically, of the fire department and the police in their efforts to find people.
That helmet you're wearing signifies what?
Signifies you don't want to get your head caved in by a piece of falling debris. These were given away, Larry. These helmets were given away.
What do you do for a living, Gil?
I'm a filmmaker. That's what I do, Larry.
Aha. So you were appropriately armed, in a sense.
I came back armed. I worked 13 hours without a camera, had no intention of shooting anything. When I finally made it to the epicenter, which was at night, I got down there at about 10 at night. One of my first assignments was to move 11 surgeons to the new triage center, which was no longer at North Moore Street and Greenwich, but was down right across the street at One Liberty Plaza, a building which is going to be falling down if it hasn't already. So,
boy, wow, what a thing to live through.
Yes.
Thank you, Gil. Gil Baker.
You're welcome.
Wow. Joining us now in Washington, 3 distinguished members of the United States Senate. Senator Joseph Lieberman, Democrat of Connecticut. He, of course, was his party. That is Senator Biden that you're looking at. There is Senator Lieberman. He is the Democrat of Connecticut, member of the Armed Services Committee, and a chairman of Governmental Affairs, and the former vice presidential candidate of his party. Senator Joe Biden now is Democrat of Delaware, chairman of Foreign Relations. And Senator Jon Kyl, our friend from Arizona, a member of the Select Intelligence Committee, a ranking member of Judiciary Committee's Subcommittee on Technology, Terrorism, and Government Information. And let's go first to Jon Kyl on Capitol Hill before we talk with our senators. John?
Larry, I've got some new information for you. What we have learned is that Republicans and Democrats on the leadership level are working with the White House right now on what some are calling a resolution authorizing the use of force to respond to these attacks. J.C. Watts, one of the members of the Republican leadership in the House, is calling it a resolution of resolve. We know this congressional leaders on both sides say this was a request that came from the White House for such a resolution. Language is being worked out. There are some concerns that have already been raised by some Democratic members that this could be something like a Gulf of Tonkin resolution. They don't want to go that far. They don't want to allow a blank check for military action. But this is something that right now over on the House side, leadership members on both sides trying to work out some kind of an agreement on language, because the White House wants something further, something more than what the Congress did today. As you know, the Congress today debated a resolution, passed resolution in the Senate 100-0, basically condemning this act and calling for unity and calling for action. This would be something a little bit further, something like what we saw back in 1991 with the Gulf War resolution authorizing the use of force, but there's no agreement yet on exactly how far that would go, but this is something that's going on right now at this late hour in the Capitol.
Thanks, John. And Senator Lieberman, your comment on what Jon Kyl just told us.
Larry, I haven't seen the words. I've heard about the discussions. There will not be a significant disagreement among members of the Senate, and I would guess the House, on party lines. We're all united. We support a response, retaliation, and I think even beyond that, we support a genuine, long-term, comprehensive, sustained war against terrorism until we beat it and we don't have to face this kind of tragedy again.
Senator Biden, though, Jon Kyl did say that some Democrats were a little wary, and Senator Lieberman says no. Do you join Senator Lieberman?
Well, I'm part of that group that has staff there working out the language, and the answer is there's going to be no disagreement. Originally, there was a discussion about a declaration of war, and as John McCain said earlier in the preceding program, the question was war against whom, and so there's going to be no disagreement. I predict that what we come out with will be 100-0, and I think there'll be absolute resolve. Part of the confusion related to how the request was communicated and so on, but I think it's a non-issue.
Senator Kyl, you're a member of the Select Intelligence Committee. Did intelligence fail us?
In one sense, Larry, you'd have to say it failed us because we didn't predict what was going to happen, but there's a connotation to that somebody was grossly negligent and to blame, and we cannot conclude that yet. Until we do our complete analysis, we're really not going to know what we knew. I think the key thing is we've got to continue to remind ourselves that we don't know what we don't know, and we shouldn't assume that we can predict these kinds of things.
What we do know, Senator Lieberman, is that men who shouldn't have got into airports got into airplanes and commandeered them.
Absolutely right, Larry. But by total coincidence, the committee I now chair today held a long-planned hearing on the vulnerability of America's critical infrastructure to enemy attack. We happen to focus today on computers and the way in which our financial systems and energy systems are dependent on them and they can be broken into. But the same is true of transportation and air transport. And we just let our guard down. I mean, I think yesterday was a a turning point in American history, and I think what it says to us is that we've got to begin to organize to defend our homeland in a way we never have before, because we thought the oceans protected us, but now we're subject to attack from terrorists, from cyber attackers, and indeed from ballistic missiles, and we've got to put our guard up.
Senator Biden, do we follow rules of law, something that this country and all of us are raised with, or do we, as 94% of Americans say, go in and take them out?
Well, by the way, when you go in and take them out, you don't have to follow rules of law. The rules of law apply to American citizens and people on American soil. There is not a rule of law when there's a war. There's
but you could file it. You could file it. You can go to international courts. You could file a brief with the country asking.
They actually ridiculous. Wrong. Ridiculous. Not even in the game. A country yields its sovereignty when, in fact, it participates in an act that causes grave damage to another country. There is no question under any law, international or otherwise, that if we have the proof to show that there is a complicitous country, that they have committed an act of war against us, and retaliation is fully within every single solitary category of law, international and local. That's very different. That's very different, because with all due respect, Larry, you guys keep confusing these terms, in my humble opinion. And that is, you talk about the rule of law. The rule of law applies to the United States of America and American citizens. We cannot, will not, and must adhere to. We cannot yield on that. We can't yield on the Bill of Rights. We can't yield on any of those issues as it relates to American citizens and the application of our criminal laws here in this country. But that's very different than retaliating.
Could not have been stated more forcefully. Senator Kyl, do you expect this to be swift?
Well, we've made tremendous progress just in the day and a half that have passed since this tragedy in identifying people that we think had something to do with it and expanding the investigation to a larger network. I think what we're going to find is that we will make good progress quickly because of the skill of our people, but that we're going to find a very large network of people complicit in this operation. And the difficulty is that we may find that they are people of different origins or nationalities, people who lived in different countries, who traveled to different countries, and we may find that different countries harbored some of them, and perhaps those that still live are being harbored yet in other countries. So it may be quite difficult for us to find targets here that we can retaliate against.
Larry, one very important thing.
Quickly, yeah.
Real quickly, NATO, for the first time in its history, passed what they call an Article 5 resolution saying that if this attack was organized from abroad, it is an attack against all of NATO. They will participate in any retaliation. This is the most significant thing that's happened, and Colin Powell is to be complimented in the way in which he's generating support, including from Russia, China, and moderate states in the Middle East. It's a big deal.
We thank Senators Lieberman, Biden, and Kyl. We'll be calling on them again. Joining us now to discuss this from a standpoint of aviation and aviation safety. In Columbus, Ohio, is Mary Schiavo, aviation safety expert, former Inspector General, Department of Transportation. Here in Los Angeles, Michael Barr, Director of the Aviation Safety Program at the University of Southern California. That program draws students from throughout the United States and the world. 20,000 aviation professionals have attended. Barr himself is a former Air Force fighter pilot. And in Philadelphia, a return visit from Arthur Woke, the aviation safety and law expert, a qualified pilot himself, and a strong critic of what happened. He thinks there was a total breakdown of enforcement and that this never should have happened. Mary, do you agree with that?
Absolutely. Not only was there a total breakdown, this never should have happened. The government has known about these weaknesses, has discussed these weaknesses. I participated in some of these discussions within the government literally in the early 90s, clear up through 96. This was a known weakness and an accepted risk. The only people kept in the dark were the American public.
Michael Barr?
Well, I agree. You know, the one mortal weakness and one mortal enemy of aviation safety and security is complacency. And that's exactly what we were guilty of, is complacency.
Who was complacent? The security people? All of us?
Security people, the government, the airlines, everyone. After the Pan Am 103 accident, we had 60 recommendations on security. Then we had another accident in which we said, all right, Americans are going to be victims of terrorists in America, American buildings. We must act now. That report was in 1996. after TW800, the Gore Commission. And not all those results have ever been implemented.
And the obvious question, Arthur, is why not?
Well, because we have a tombstone mentality within the agency responsible for aviation safety, and that's the Federal Aviation Administration. You know, Larry, there was a knee-jerk reaction today. The FAA implemented some rules at airports that are going to delay tens of millions of passengers. You know, not a single one of the rules implemented today would have prevented this tragedy. So the tragedy of the tragedy is that the government still doesn't get it. It still doesn't have the sense to understand what is necessary to protect our citizens, and that is sky marshals. If we have to arm the pilots, let's do it. If we have to train the flight attendants in martial arts, let's do it. If we have to scrutinize our passengers better, let's do it. But to say that curbside checking of luggage is no longer acceptable when it wouldn't have prevented anything is, in my opinion, insane.
That's right.
Mary, if you agree with that, are we reopening the airports too soon?
Absolutely. I mean, I agree with Art so much. I mean, we have talked about this before, and Larry, you have talked about this before. We are doing a lot of things because the FAA wants to show that things are back to normal. That is the worst thing that the FAA could do. That is exactly what the terrorists want us to do. We should never even consider going back to normal. And what did the FAA do today? They have made ridiculous pronouncements. At first they said they were going to open at noon. Then they left each airport to decide when they had done their sweeps. Then they made ridiculous pronouncements like no more steak knives on planes. And then they did things like curbside checking instead of what they should have been doing, which is formulating a national strategy to combat this. And I think they have positively shown today they cannot do it. Airport and aviation security is a law enforcement function. It belongs with a law enforcement agency, not the FAA.
Even if that means, Michael, just tying up airports and no traffic and people not able to fly, take a train, take a car, no business travel, I mean, the economy would stand still.
Right. I don't agree with draconian results, but what I do think is that whatever we do can't be for a week or a month or a year. It has to be forever. So we have to think these things out. A report this morning said the Seattle-Tacoma Airport is going to have no carry-on baggage, including purses. Now, what's going to happen to my blood pressure medicine? Am I going to have to put that in a suitcase and then lose the suitcase and then try to get my medicine wherever I'm going? So they got to think about this for a while.
You agree with marshals on every plane?
Yes, and I think we need to. In the report of the Gore Commission, they wanted marshals. They wanted $160 million worth of new equipment and $5 million to train new personnel. They ran out of money for marshals. The people who check you through security are nearly minimum wage, lowly trained, and they're the ones responsible for our safety.
Arthur, was the argument against it cost?
Yes. Of course. I mean, that's always the argument. That's why these things don't get accomplished. We had marshals on aircraft for many years, and they were flown randomly on flights. Well, obviously, because the threat is so much increased, we can't do it randomly. We have to have them on every flight. You know, one of the things that struck me about the program tonight, Larry, were the people in Washington saying that they have oversight responsibility. Well, let me say this to them, that oversight responsibility does not mean overlook. It means look over.
That's right.
And that's the problem that we have in Washington. Oversight to them means overlook.
And is that because, Mary, basically we're a society that's just not used to this, and it's easy to get complacent? Things go along pretty well, we stop doing the checks. We play the people. How much do these people get at the check-in gates?
Well, it is because in some ways we are complacent, but it's also told that we were told to be complacent. The federal government, I have been in meetings in the Department of Transportation where literally officials with the FAA said, look, we need to give the impression of security, but we can't possibly make airports and aircraft safe. If we did, it would cost $10 billion. And the reason they said that was, it was actually trifold. One, they said because domestic aviation was not targeted, they rated the threat as very low, instead of realizing that because we're not doing anything about it, it's actually very high. Simply because it hasn't been carried out in the past does not mean it doesn't exist. 2, they said the airlines don't want to pay for the security measures, and passengers would not want raised fares. And 3, there were actually objections from certain labor unions and workforce groups about having additional security. They did not want full background checks. They complained about having convictions knock you out of employment, and they didn't want that. And in the end, they blamed it on the passengers. They said the passengers won't put up with delays.
Let's take a call. Fort Dodge, Iowa, for our panel. Hello.
Yeah, why don't you just seal the bulkhead between the passenger and pilot compartment with no possible entry through it either direction once the plane's in flight, and have no communication between the two except through the ground?
Michael?
Well, I don't think you need to seal it permanently, but what you need to do is get the door in there that is a strong security door. Right now we have a door that stops somebody from going in the cockpit if they want to go to the bathroom.
But what if then, Michael, if a hostage taker just said, "Open the door, I'm going to start killing people"?
Then you have to have trained for that and made the decision on whether or not that is going to be followed, or the risk of another World Trade Center is greater than the loss of some members of the crew or passengers. It's a hard choice. It's the same hard choice you would give a fighter pilot to shoot down an airliner if it's heading for Washington Central.
And that's what you would do, right?
If they told me to, yes, I would.
You would shoot down an airliner with people on it?
Yes, I would. If they were heading for a building that 10,000 people in it, yes.
Arthur Walk, would your marshals be armed?
Oh, of course. And they were armed before. They had guns that were designed so that they wouldn't penetrate the airplane structure, and that's what they need to have. But you have to remember, Larry, that one of the things that strikes me is that if you stop terrorism where you're supposed to, which is before it gets to the airport, you don't have to worry about the sky marshals having to exercise their authority. But the bottom line is, now we know, as we have for the last 20 years or so, that we need sky marshals, and now we need to come up with the money for it. And I'll be the first one to send my $300 tax refund back so they can apply it to that purpose.
So just so we get the record straight, Arthur, you would favor, until major steps are taken, keeping these airports closed?
No. I believe that we have to implement sky marshals immediately. And if that requires marshals that come from the United States Marshal Service immediately...
if they don't do it immediately, you wouldn't open them till they do it.
I think that we have to be very, very careful. We certainly have to put sky marshals on randomly at the beginning, and then gradually increase it so they're on every flight.
Now, I thank you all very much. We expect to hear a lot more from you, Michael and Arthur and Mary Schiavo. We'll conclude our program with a visit with Dr. James Dobson, with Rabbi Harold Kushner and Father Michael Manning, and get their perspective. Tonight at the Capitol, a prayer vigil. Listen and watch.
Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now am found. Was blind, but now I see.
Joining us now from Colorado Springs is Dr. James Dobson, president of Focus on the Family and author of a new book, When God Doesn't Make Sense. That title would well apply to events yesterday. In Boston is Rabbi Harold Kushner. He's written many books, his most famous one, of course, Why Bad Things Happen to Good People, and also the new one, Living a Life That Matters. And here in Los Angeles, Father Michael Manning, Roman Catholic priest and host of his own television show, The Word in the World. Dr. Dobson, we could well ask, did God make any sense yesterday?
Well, Larry, it's certain that this situation is very difficult to understand, and there are no easy answers for it. And people who think they have it figured out just haven't lived long enough, I think. There are circumstances in our lives, and I try to write about that, when the pieces just don't fit. And we believe that our obligation in moments like that is to go on trusting and depending on the Lord and looking to Him for solace, and millions have done that.
Rabbi Kushner, why did bad things happen to so many good people yesterday?
Because human beings are free to decide if they want to do good things or bad things. And some of those human beings are so filled with rage that they go crazy and hurt other people in the process. I don't think it was God pulling the strings. You know where I found God yesterday, Larry? In those firemen and policemen who were willing to risk their lives to try and save other lives. In the people who lined up for hours to give blood. That's what God was doing. God wasn't making planes crash.
An all-powerful God, though, Father, could have prevented it, couldn't He?
Well, He could have prevented it, but the reality is He loves us too much to allow us to take away our freedom. He believes in us, and He believes...
He loved all those people who went and smashing into that building.
Oh, yes, but he believes that there's a battle for evil. I see this as a battle. I see it as a big battle, and as a Christian...
Evil won yesterday?
They gave a good blow, but I certainly don't think that we're down. I think that we're in a battle with evil, and we got to fight it. That's the Our Father. Deliver us from evil, and we've got to fight continually for that.
Dr. Dobson, how do we deal with the anger we have?
Well, Larry, let me first say that I agree with what the other two gentlemen just said. We can't blame this on God. I don't believe that He did it, and He has given us a free will. And if He had not given us that, we would be nothing but puppets on a string. And so people do evil things, and evil people do terrible things like we've seen here. As far as grief is concerned, this is a horrible experience for the nation, and we're not going to get over it easily. It's going to take time, and we are going to have have an opportunity to think through what's happened to us and let our emotions heal. But ultimately, I believe that we turn for solace to God, who has been there with us through our crises in the past. Americans are very resilient. They have many resources, and two of the greatest are their families and their faith, and I believe that's where we'll turn this time.
Rabbi Kushner, what is your thoughts on the obvious anger people have today toward people whose nationality is different from theirs, or people from a certain region, or the desire to just strike back tomorrow?
Larry, I would hope that we'd be able to do something better with our anger than do what those crazed hijackers did yesterday and try and hurt people because they don't like them, disagree with their politics, or find themselves members of a different faith. If we do anything like that, we lower ourselves to their level. And I would hope that there's a more honorable way of paying tribute to the people whose lives were taken yesterday. Larry, you realize all over this country, rabbis are throwing out their high holiday sermons and writing new ones because of what happened yesterday. I spoke to a colleague yesterday about what there is to say about this, and I was impressed by what he said. He said, now we are all Israelis. That is, we have learned what the Israelis have had to live with for 53 years, the sense of vulnerability and the determination to go on living your normal lives and not let the bad guys take over the field.
What do you say to children, Father Manning, who point to the screen and say, why did they do that?
Why did they do that? Because I believe that the battle was not fought in the right way. It's a battle of continually trying to find out where there's injustice and working as hard as we can to overcome that. But at the same time, we have to face the fact that there is evil in the world, and we talk about grief, we talk about the real necessity of talking to those kids and letting them, making sure that we listen to them and we hear them, but we give them a deep reflection of faith and understanding that there's something more powerful and good than all the evil that comes. We got to fight it.
That's good. That's tough convincing, isn't it, Dr. Dobson?
It certainly is, but I think it's very important for parents to know that the security and sense of well-being of their children is rooted in their relationship with their parents. And if they see their parents in anguish, if they see them expressing too much grief, if they allow them to see videos of this horrible experience and they perceive it as an ongoing crisis, then the children are going to suffer. And I think it's very important for us to keep them talking and to let them know that we're not frightened. And at that point, again, I point us back to prayer. And you can teach children to pray and ask them to, or teach them to pray for the people who are hurting and those who are in the hospital, for the firemen and the others, and certainly for the president. And I think you can help them gradually learn to deal with this.
Rabbi, with something like this, are there moments where you doubt your faith?
No, it's moments when I call on my faith, because where else do I get the courage to get on an airplane next week, to go shopping next week, to invite my family to come up for the High Holy Days with us? If I didn't have that faith that ultimately the world rewards goodness, I don't think I could go on in the face of cruelty like what we experienced yesterday.
And one of the weird things in dealing with the faith, Father, is that these people were probably religious fanatics, right?
They were thinking that God was calling them.
So they had a faith.
Yes, they had a faith in God. And this is, as a Catholic, I know that we can have an experience of looking back to the Inquisition and looking at things like the Crusades and saying, we missed the boat. But I think we've got to say, well, let's learn. Let's make sure that as followers of God, we're not allowing a God of over-judgment to lose the God of patience and kindness and love for us.
We thank all of our guests for being with us tonight. These are very, very, very difficult times, and at CNN we are trying to do the best to cover it as best we can, bringing you all angles with the full understanding that we are being seen all around the world and that the world shares in our grief. Coming up next is a CNN special report. It'll be co-anchored by Aaron Brown and the newest member of our CNN team who was with us earlier tonight, Paula Zahn. Aaron and Paula are next. As we leave you with that hole in the ground in New York, and we'll see you tomorrow night. I'm Larry King.
This is a CNN special report. America under attack. In New York, Aaron Brown and Paula Zahn.
Good evening again, everyone. We're now 37 hours or so since this atrocity was committed. 30-some blocks from where we are. You can hear the sirens still in the background. This rescue mission, which has proceeded very, very slowly, has gotten much more complicated tonight. It's gotten more complicated because another building is in danger of coming down. One Liberty Plaza, about a 60-story building. We were down in the area, and you could actually see pieces of the building, glass from the windows facing to the building coming off. They moved everybody out, and they cannot move people back in to start the search for survivors, and they still believe there may be some in there until they figure out a way to stabilize that building, and that's not an easy thing to do. In the hour ahead, we have, we'll update you on the situation at Ground Zero. We have a fair amount to tell you about that. We want at some point here to offer up a sense of the human dramas that have taken place. There are some horrible, truly horrible stories and some rich stories of heroism that we want to tell you about as well. But most importantly, and certainly at the beginning, there are a number of important and in some cases dramatic breaking news developments, and that's where we want to begin. Paula.
Yeah, at the top of the show, we're going to get into the news about federal agents actually taking into custody a number of men in Providence, Rhode Island, a couple of cities in South Florida, and in Boston. We're going to get to that a little bit later on, but I think, Aaron, you would agree, one of the greatest mysteries now of this whole tragedy is how it is that 4 planes were hijacked in a relatively short period of time. And right now, we're going to go to Kelly Arena, who is going to provide us with some of the first insights we actually have as to what exactly went on Flight 93. That was the flight headed from Dulles Airport to San Francisco. Kelly, what can you tell us tonight?
Paula, as CNN has reported throughout the day, a microphone was keyed open on the hijacked flight that crashed in Pennsylvania. Now, CNN has obtained a partial transcript of what was heard by air traffic control from the cockpit. That's United Airlines Flight 93. It actually departed Newark for San Francisco. It was flying at 35,000 feet over the Cleveland area. Now, at this point, air traffic controllers heard shouting in the cockpit with someone yelling, "Get out of here." The microphone is momentarily turned off. It comes back on, some scuffling is heard, and again a voice yells, "Get out of here." The microphone is again turned off. When it is turned on again, it's clear that the pilot is no longer in the cockpit. Someone is heard speaking in broken English in what was described as an Arabic accent, telling passengers, quote, "There's a bomb on board. This is the captain speaking. Remain in your seat. There is a bomb on board. Stay quiet. We are meeting with their demands. We are returning to the airport. Now, to supplement that transcript, we do have some information on what was going on outside the cockpit. Family members of one passenger who phoned his family on his cell phone said the passengers, after learning that the World Trade Center had been hit, had voted to attack the terrorists. Nothing else, unfortunately, was heard from the passengers after that. That flight did hold 38 passengers and a crew of 8. Paula, Aaron?
It is so chilling to hear these accounts, Kelly. We have now, too, heard these dramatic stories of passengers on several of these flights making contact with family members, telling family members they love them. Barbara Olson, who was a contributor here at CNN, actually telling her husband exactly what was going on, and at one point sort of indicating that she needed some advice on how she could interact with the captain of the plane to prevent this horrible tragedy that it all seems but certain she sort of had a whiff of was about to happen.
Kelly, before you get away, just give me a little bit of what's going on and how we're getting this stuff. Do you expect that you're going to get full transcripts? Do you expect you're going to see, for example, what went on in the other planes in the hours perhaps, or at least the day ahead?
Well, Aaron, this was the only plane that we are aware of that actually had its microphone turned on at any point. Of course, if the black boxes are ever recovered, we may get more information. That is going to be very difficult we're told by aviation experts at the sites concerning the World Trade Center and also here at the Pentagon. About the only black box that might be gettable at this point is the flight that did indeed crash in Pennsylvania, because they have access to that plane and to the wreckage more easily than they have access to the others. But this was not something that was officially given to us. We obtained this through sources. So for now, everything is mum as the investigation continues.
We won't ask any more about it. We don't want any sources to get burned here. Thank you for your work. That is quite remarkable stuff. Late this afternoon, we also were we better understood the president's movements yesterday. You recall, it took the president a long time, essentially all day, to get from Sarasota, Florida, where he started his day yesterday to make a speech on education, back to the White House. And I think a lot of us wondered why it took so long, what was going on. Our senior White House correspondent, John King, can join us now and provide the answers to that. John, good evening again.
Aaron, more information on the president's return to Washington tonight. Also a major development that gives us some indication of where this story might be headed in the days ahead. CNN has learned that over the past several hours, senior administration officials in negotiations with key members of Congress on what they are calling a resolution of resolve. Translation, a resolution authorizing the president to use force to retaliate for these terrorist attacks on the United States. Negotiations went on for several hours today, including the White House faxing proposed language to key members of Congress. We are told those negotiations will resume in the morning. All this as we saw the president today taking stock of some of the devastation caused by these catastrophic attacks and leading intensifying discussions debating just how the United States should respond.
A first-hand look at the devastation at the Pentagon and a patriotic moment even as the building continued to smolder.
Coming here makes me sad on the one hand. It also makes me angry. And our country will, however, not be cowed by terrorists, by people who don't share the same values we share. Thank you, sir.
This tour as the White House responded to questions about why it took so long for the president to return to Washington after the attacks. The administration said it had reliable information that the jet that barreled into the Pentagon was initially heading toward the White House. That triggered this evacuation. And sources tell CNN the vice president and other top officials were ushered from their offices to a fortified command and control center deep under the White House grounds. The administration said Air Force One also was a target, and that is why Mr. Bush stopped at 2 military bases on a 9-hour trip back to Washington from Florida, and had fighter jet escorts on the final leg home, even after the government was certain all commercial jetliners were accounted for and on the ground.
The information that we had was real and credible about Air Force One. the manner in which Air Force One operated maintained the security of Air Force One at all times.
Mr. Bush met twice with his national security team, and sources tell CNN the discussions included an update on the fast-developing investigation and talk of possible U.S. military responses. Mr. Bush called the attacks acts of war, and in the words of one senior official familiar with the evidence, quote, everything points to the terrorist network of Osama bin Laden.
This enemy hides in shadows and has no regard for human life. This is an enemy who preys on innocent and unsuspecting people, then runs for cover.
Now, as the administration negotiates with Congress over that resolution authorizing force, also a major diplomatic push by the White House as it tries to build what it is calling a broad international coalition to fight terrorism. The president spoke personally today with the leaders of Great Britain, Canada, France, Germany, Russia, and China. The Secretary of State involved in these efforts as well. More calls from the president expected tomorrow, and the White House welcoming gladly a resolution from NATO equating these attacks on the United States to an attack on the NATO alliance. Again, the administration negotiating with Congress on two fronts now, Aaron. One, a resolution authorizing the use of force. Another, they're hoping to get a bill to the president's desk as early as tomorrow afternoon, authorizing $20 billion to pay for the early recovery and investigative efforts. Aaron?
John, here's my opportunity to be naive for the moment. What's this a negotiation over? I saw, as you did, all of the members of Congress standing shoulder to shoulder, as they said 3 or 4 times. What is the negotiation here?
Well, certainly the negotiation is over the specific language. We heard some guests earlier on Larry King Live when we first reported this saying they didn't foresee there being a problem. Some questions in Congress about giving the president a blank check. Remember, they have yet to announce any conclusions of the investigation, yet to say officially who they believe or which parties they believe are responsible for this. So in the Congress right now, they don't want this to become a Tonkin Gulf resolution. They don't want some open-ended resolution, but we are told progress being made in negotiations on a resolution that would say if the administration has credible evidence as to who is responding, then the Congress would support using force to retaliate.
And John, just quickly, in the normal course of events, in a normal day when the president travels, are there military escorts flying with the president?
There are often military escorts in the air. Very rare that we, the reporters traveling on Air Force One or with the president on another aircraft, would see them. They do go up as routine security at a distance just to be safe, especially on international trips. To see a fighter jet just off the wing of Air Force One, quite extraordinary. That a sign of the intense security triggered by this event, and there are other security precautions being taken as well. CNN, in fact, has been told the vice president not staying in his official residence here in Washington. He is staying in a more secure location for now.
And weren't we told yesterday that the Secret Service said or believed that Air Force One was not at risk?
Yes, we were told that. Secret Service saying throughout the day that they did not believe Air Force One was at risk. Now officials saying that they do believe that it may have been a potential target, but they note that that's why it did not come back to Washington. They would say now that it was not at risk because it did not return to airspace anywhere near Washington, anywhere near the northern half of the country for that matter, until they had accounted for all commercial airliners. At the time the president left Florida for Louisiana, when he left Florida originally, that plane that crashed outside of Pittsburgh was still in the air. U.S. officials now saying once they knew all the planes were down, all the other planes were accounted for, so they waited for some planes to land that the FAA had instructed to land. Only then, when the skies were clear, did the president return to Washington.
John, thank you. Our senior White House correspondent, John King, at the White House on his post tonight. John, thanks. Paul?
As you know, Aaron, because you've been on the air most of the day, as I have, we don't even know what day it is anymore. One of the challenges of covering this story is the information comes at us and in small pieces, and we're just beginning to be able to put some of this stuff together. The Attorney General John Ashcroft confirming that the suspected hijackers actually were, some of them, trained in the United States as pilots. He also confirmed that the planes, individual planes that were hijacked by as many as 3 to 6 individuals on each plane, some of them using knives and box cutters, and as Kelly Arena just reported, in the case of this flight going from Newark to San Francisco, bomb threats. Federal agents have taken some folks into custody in Boston, Providence, Rhode Island, Vero Beach, and Venice, Florida, and right now we're going to go to a report by Mike Betcher that helps us all better understand how broad this investigation is underway tonight.
From Maine to Florida, the investigation moved quickly along the eastern seaboard.
We have, in the last 24 hours, taken the manifests and used those as an evidentiary base, and have talked to many of the families of the victims, and have successfully, I believe, identified many of the hijackers on each of the 4 flights that went down.
Federal investigators now believe they know the identity of 4 men capable of piloting the 2 planes that left Boston and crashed into the World Trade Center. The key: rental cars parked by the suspected terrorist at Portland International Airport and Boston's Logan Airport, each yielding clues that ultimately led investigators to flight schools in Florida.
A number of the suspected hijackers were trained as pilots in the United States.
Rental records for the car left in Portland brought investigators to residences in Vero Beach, Florida, which were searched by the FBI. Inside one house, pictures of Adnan Bukhari and a pilot certificate from a Florida flight school in his name. Also found inside the residence, another pilot certificate for Amir Abbas Bukhari. Another certificate indicates that at least one of the Bukharis participated in a program to help train Saudi Airlines employees. Federal investigators believe the 2 men are brothers and prime suspects. FBI agents also visited other Florida locations after gathering clues from the second rental car parked at Boston's Logan Airport that led to the identity of 2 more men, also pilots, Mohammed Atta and Marwan Youssef Al-Shehi, who received at least some flight training at Huffman Aviation in Venice, Florida. Charles Voss is a bookkeeper at Huffman Aviation who briefly allowed the 2 men to stay at his house.
They were, like I said, students, and they arrived over there a year ago. It was in last July. And when they first arrived, they had no place to stay. They just popped in pretty much, as I recall, unannounced. And so we provided them, for the benefit of the flight school, provided them a place to stay for a few days.
At least one person believed to be an acquaintance of the Bukharis has been taken into custody for questioning.
There have been occasions where we have interviewed individuals and come to find that the individual is out of status, and that individual has been detained on an immigration hold. But there have been no arrests relating to these hijackings at this point.
Having found the 4 men, federal investigators believe piloted the 2 hijacked jets into the World Trade Center towers, they are now scouring Florida flight schools, searching for the pilots of the other 2 jetliners, one that crashed in Pennsylvania, the other that rammed the Pentagon.
Now, about the nationality of those 4 suspects, the Bukhari brothers are Saudis, according to sources, and the other 2 suspects are holders of United Arab Emirate passports. Now, we have several new pieces of information provided by CNN correspondent Eileen O'Connor, who has been providing new information all day long. She says 3 people were taken into custody in an FBI raid at the Westin Copley Hotel in Boston. They are material witnesses. They were not arrested. They are material witnesses. They have also learned, according to her sources, federal investigators, they've also learned that 7 of the airline tickets were purchased with 1 credit card. That is a critical piece of information, according to those investigators. As well, we've learned that, and Eileen O'Connor has learned, that America Online, which is the parent company of CNN, has handed over records on email accounts that were used by suspects in this case. And as well, Eileen O'Connor is reporting that 2 hijackers used a ferry to get to the United States to Bar Harbor, Maine from Nova Scotia. So they used a ferry to reach this country. Paula?
Mike, if you could clear up something for us tonight. I know some of the officials I've talked to are quite sensitive about calling these men who have been taken into custody as suspects. Can we, with great comfort, call all these men that are being questioned suspects tonight, or just a couple of them? What is their status?
Well, Paula, those who are living, who were taken, the people at the hotel who were taken, are material witnesses. We're not calling them suspects. The federal investigators aren't calling them suspects. But the 4 people who the federal investigators say are suspects, the Bukhari brothers and the other 2 people down in Florida, they believe those 4 people are dead, Paula, and they were on the airplane and are very likely the 4 people who would have flown the aircraft, the 2 airplanes, into the 2 World Trade Center towers.
Mike, earlier today you spent some time focusing in on reports that both surfaced in the Boston Globe and the Boston Herald showing the vulnerabilities of Logan Airport. Those reporters calling the security procedures there in some cases shoddy. Based on what you're learning about what has been retrieved from that car that was parked at Logan Airport, could anything have stopped these guys? Any security procedures have stopped these guys from carrying off what they accomplished out of Logan Airport?
Well, you know, Paula, let me answer it this way. I spent 5 weeks in Beirut this summer. A lot of it doing stories on suicide bombers for later reporting that I'm doing. And a suicide bomber, there's very little chance of stopping a suicide bomber. They believe they're going to glory. That's why they leave behind clues. They want people to know who they are because, Paula, they believe they aren't coming back and they're going on to a better life. That is their belief.
Walk us through very briefly what you think we can expect tomorrow in terms of even more developments on this front.
Well, the FBI is checking flight schools in Florida and other parts of the country. They believe they'll find the pilots of the other 2 aircraft, the one that crashed in Pennsylvania and the one that crashed into the Pentagon. They're desperately trying to find those other pilots, but I got to tell you, they've moved very quickly today, have done an excellent job. They've already, in this day after, have what they believe are 4 of the pilots involved in this.
All right, Mike Boettcher, thanks for your complete reporting. Aaron and I are about to be drowned out by sirens. I don't think we have any idea.
Yeah, I have some idea.
What is going on down
I have some idea. You can hear the sirens. I'm going to turn my back on you for a second. We've been seeing police and fire moving up the street here, and we are told now that the Empire State Building, one of the absolute symbols of the city of New York, is being evacuated. There's a lot we don't know, okay? We do not know what is precipitating this. We don't know if there was a call, if there's obviously some belief that there's a threat to the building, but we don't know where that came from, where it was directed to, why now, what is happening. What we do know, and the most important thing to tell you right now, is that the Empire State Building, one of the symbols of this city of New York, perhaps in many ways other than the Statue of Liberty, the best known symbol. You can see the building. It's not very far from where we are. I mean, I'm literally looking at it as you are from our camera location. It is being evacuated.
Now, Aaron, what I'm noticing is, if you were to contrast this with last night, no lights are on in the building.
Well, and I may be wrong about this, but it seemed to me, you guys have been looking at this as well, that a couple of minutes ago when I first heard this, there was more light in that building than there is now. And I have no idea if there is any significance to that. But the building is being evacuated, and there are office workers in the building. We assume maintenance people working through the building, as in most of these office buildings at night. People who came to work today in the city, and believe me, there wasn't a lot of work getting done here today. We suspect have gone home long ago. We don't know how many people are in the Empire State Building, but all of them are being told to get out. And you heard, as we were talking just a moment ago, the sound of the sirens coming up what are essentially empty streets here. It's not like they need the sirens to clear people out of the way, but they were, and there were a fair number of them coming up the street, and we assume that that is related to whatever is going on in the Empire State Building. We assume that in part because the World Trade Center itself, ground zero in all of this, is still 30 blocks or so, give or take, from the Empire State Building from where we are tonight.
Now, what some folks who don't live in New York might not know is that the top of the Empire State Building is usually lighted to indicate what the weather pattern is in the city. Last night, the lights were out to indicate the tremendous loss that was suffered here.
Now, down at ground zero, the rescue operation, I want to turn the other way for a second. I want to turn the other way. I believe you can see it, and I'll step out of the way if that helps, but it almost looks like it's been lighted. You can see the smoke coming up, and there does seem to be some light in back of it. I'm gonna guess here, and it is only a guess, that what you've got is power generators and night lights working to allow the rescue crews that are in the area to work at night. Part of the reason I believe this is as I was making my way down towards the building this afternoon, there were lines, there were dozens, I mean dozens of generators and night lights that were waiting on the West Side Highway, a major thoroughfare in New York, waiting to get into the area so that the relief and the rescue crews could work through the night. There were dozens of those generators. There were also dozens of construction vehicles as well, and we now presume that they are getting that kind of lighting so that they can continue this very slow operation. Also, we will tell you within, well, literally across the street from where we are.
Aaron, there's another thing I need to add. While you were talking, I have just learned that Penn Station is currently being evacuated. Once again, we have very limited information on this.
And Penn Station is literally across the street from where we're standing. I mean, it is, you walk across the street from this building at 5 Penn Plaza in New York, and you are in Penn Station. Now, why this is happening, where these threats, why officials believe these buildings are at risk, we do not know. Penn Station takes commuters. The Amtrak comes out of Penn Station. It is a very busy place in New York. It is directly connected to Madison Square Garden, as they say, the world's most famous arena, and another one of those symbols of New York. And so now, two enormously well-known buildings, the Empire State Building, Penn Station adjacent to Madison Square Garden, and adjacent to where we are being evacuated, and we don't know if it's a hoax or it's serious or what it is. We just know what's happening.
And as these threats are being investigated, we should also point out that as we stand here on this platform, there is great concern about the structural status of a 54-story tower that sits across from what is left of that World Trade Center complex. The west side of the building is seriously degraded. This has meant that rescuers had to be evacuated from some of the perimeter areas surrounding the World Trade Center because of the imminent danger. We should say about the only ray of hope coming out of New York City earlier today was the fact that rescue workers were able to successfully rescue some 11 people. 6 of them firefighters, 3 police officers, 2 civilians, one of whom actually made a cell phone call to a family member saying he was trapped inside the rubble. Unfortunately, we are dealing now with the reality that firefighters are telling us about, that 90% of the folks you rescue are usually rescued within the first 24 hours of a catastrophe. That does not mean that rescuers are giving up hope, but that is the cold, stark reality this evening.
We are obviously doing very aggressive reporting now, trying to figure out why it is that officials have ordered the evacuation of these 2 buildings, Penn Station and the Empire State Building. We'll just keep coming back to this until we figure out what's happening down there and what either local police or federal officials believe is the threat. Down at the Trade Center itself, reporters have been making their way through the area. I'm going to take a chance that Brian Nelson can hear me now. Can he? Brian, are you down there?
I can hear you, Eric. Yes, I can. Yes, I can hear you.
Brian,
I'm down here about 5 to 7 blocks.
Can you
hear me?
Yeah, we hear you fine, and we see you as well. You're on the video phone. Our viewers, I think, are familiar with that. Again, tell us where you are, and then tell us what you can see.
Well, we're about 5 to 7 blocks away from the ruins of the World Trade Center, and this is really ground zero, as you call it. And all day long since this afternoon into this evening, there have been a parade of trucks coming in and out of here. On the way in, those trucks are carrying heavy machinery, front loaders, back haulers, and some very big haulers. They go in empty, and they return maybe a couple of hours later And those haulers are carrying pieces of twisted debris, girders that have just been wrecked beyond description. There are pieces of concrete, and there are cars that have been caught and demolished in the wreckage that are sitting on top of that pile. They are all being carried out of here one piece at a time. And we also see, and this is the grim part of this story, Aaron, refrigerated trucks also going out, and we presume that they're carrying human remains. The rescue workers, though, have been picking over the debris at the World Trade Center with dogs, and doing it so very gingerly. They're using the dogs particularly because they have a scent, of course, and they are afraid to disturb the remains there. And so they are not using a lot of the heavy equipment they have. They are using pieces. They're picking it out one piece at a time so as not to force any collapse that would jeopardize anyone still alive beneath. This is ground central, as I mentioned earlier. It's also ground central for fear, apprehension. Behind me, and Paula mentioned this earlier, is the Liberty Plaza building. I don't think you can see it in the darkness, but that building is believed to have been structurally weakened in the collapse of the World Trade Center, and so there is some danger that it might collapse itself. And so the press have been pushed back at least a block or two from where they were earlier just because of that danger. There was also rumors of a gas leak today that sent hundreds of people stampeding down the streets away from the scene of the World Trade Center, and that includes all the rescue workers. They're very much afraid that something might explode, and that turned out to be not the case. And we had a woman down here, a very emotional woman down here where the press is corralled. She was carrying posters and pictures of people who I presume she worked with, and she was just very emotional because they had not been seen for days.
Brian, terrific work, and I apologize for interrupting you, but I'm going to do it anyway, and we'll talk about it later. We've got something that's unfolding now. Paula.
There is a news conference going underway in Los Angeles. The brother of one of the pilots of the plane that slammed into the Pentagon is now talking to the press.
In Arlington National Cemetery, Chick was actively involved in the Leadership Endowment Project for the United States Naval Academy Foundation. He was an exemplary human being. He was a hero long before this happened, and he was a hero to our entire family. We'll take a few questions.
Being a graduate of the U.S. Naval Academy, I mean, it shows just that alone. He was an extraordinary individual. Was he also extraordinarily patriotic? And what would he have thought about the action taken against all these civilians? Any idea?
I can tell you that my brother was a very patriotic American. His biography is a testament to that. His chief concern when this was going on, I can assure all of the passengers on his airplane and his, or the loved ones of those passengers and his crew members, his chief concern would have been their safety. He had impeccable judgment. That judgment was carefully honed as a naval officer flying on landing jets on carrier decks in the middle of the night. He was a very brave man. What would he have thought of, from a political point of view? I assure you that wouldn't have been going on in his mind. He would have been he was a very disciplined man who would have been working at the task at hand. And those people need to know that their captain was very, very brave. He was the quintessential example of courage under fire.
Brad, you spoke a little bit ago about your brother as being a hero. We're hearing bits and pieces now about what may have happened on board these flights. When you hear the narrative from the federal officials about what perhaps went down with the box cutters and overtaking the cockpits and the like, what are your thoughts? How do you think your brother may have held up in that circumstance?
I'm reluctant to speculate on what he would have done or what happened on board that flight. That's for the federal authorities to review and discover, although I know Chick would have done absolutely the right thing in the best interest for his fellow crew members and for every single passenger on that plane.
Had he ever spoken about the possibility of being hijacked?
Chick was always reassuring people that airplanes are one of the safest places you can be. I'm sure that he was aware that when he went to work that there was always a possibility of some kind of catastrophe. But for him, it was very, very remote. I don't think that when Chick went to work, he thought about hijacking. But that doesn't mean that he didn't conduct himself in the most impeccable fashion.
At one point, you were looking at the split-screen image of the damage caused by the plane hitting the Pentagon. Excuse me. And one of the points we need to make now is that White House spokesman Ari Fleischer confirmed earlier today that, in fact, the intended target of that plane was not the Pentagon, but perhaps the White House. And he also acknowledged that Air Force One was considered a target of this attack. Instead, this plane went down into the Pentagon. There are chilling accounts of how the plane made a 250-degree turn as it came into a very low angle over the land surrounding the Pentagon. Aaron?
Well, we have told you the Empire State Building is being evacuated. Penn Station is being evacuated. More lives are being disrupted tonight as they were yesterday. It seems in some moments, to be honest, that there isn't a New Yorker who hasn't had their lives disrupted by this tragedy, this atrocity that has taken place in this city. Every time we hear sirens, I'll confess, we're not so cold about this and we don't jump a little bit. You hear them and it gets a little scary. And it is that kind of feeling, that fear and that anger that we have found consistently on the streets of our city. More on that to your CNN's Beth Nissen.
This is what New Yorkers woke up to this morning. Those who'd managed to sleep at all during a night of surreal quiet. No planes overhead, no car alarms, strangely no sirens. This morning, no traffic jams, no rush hour crowds, no 110-story buildings where 2 had stood yesterday. People rushed to buy up postcards, vibrant reminders of what New York City looked like on Monday.
I'm used to seeing the Twin Towers, and this morning they weren't there. And it was sad. It was just sad. It's just horrible.
Yesterday it was all so unreal, so distant. By today, it had hit home. So many people knew the name of someone who never called home yesterday, never came back from work. A neighbor, a friend, a brother-in-law.
This is what he looks like, and if anyone's seen anything, we'd appreciate them calling to try to help us out. The phone number is 718-432-5982, and anything that anyone can do to try to help us find him.
People who hadn't read a newspaper in months hunted down copies today, read every word, gasped at still photos that stopped the heart. It had happened. It had really happened. Slowly today, the state of stun, the disbelief, gave way. In some cases to anger. In this city of fast moves and blunt words, there were many who wanted vengeance in a New York minute.
I've always been a bleeding heart liberal, but right now I certainly feel a lot of anger, and, you know, I mean, there's a side of me that wants to see our government just go and whoever's an enemy, just hit him now and ask questions later.
But as most people began to comprehend what had happened at the World Trade Center, what had to have happened to all those people, disbelief gave way to sorrow, to great aching sadness. So many people in this city of walkers walked with their heads low today, depressed, defeated somehow. The bad guys seem to have won this time. Americans don't have much experience with defeat. New Yorkers don't ever admit it. Hundreds lined up on the West Side Highway, the main access to the attack site, to offer their support, to rally their spirits. But on the day after, just one long day, millions of New Yorkers are already so weary. New Yorkers don't wait well, and they've had to wait for the phone calls saying, "I'm fine, she's okay," or "We haven't heard from him yet." They've had to wait for hard facts. How many saved? How many lost? Who did this? And why? And today they began to realize the waiting may last weeks, months, even years. The waiting for answers, for comfort, for peace of mind, for justice. For the first day they wake up and don't immediately think of this. Beth Nissen, CNN, New York.
And right now, it is time to check in with Tricia Stevens. You were one of the very lucky ones. You were working in 2 World Trade Center.
Yes.
Explain to us where you were when these attacks happened.
We were on the 98th floor of 2 World Trade Center. It was about a few minutes to 9. We were at our desks, and the person who sits behind me, thank God, Sandra, was the first to see the flames that were coming from the impact from 1 World Trade Center. And she screamed, "It's a bomb, let's get out of here." And that just sent us all running. We ran to the staircase. We ran down 20 flights of stairs from 98 to 78. And I was so lucky I got on the first elevator down. And it's the express elevator down to floor 1. When we got to floor 1, we had people telling us to just get out of there, get out of there. And as soon as we got to the door leading to the outside, we heard this noise. I call it the sound of destruction, because that's all you could really think that it was. And you just heard this massive sound. What I later learned was the plane crashing into the building, and debris falling, and people screaming. And
how did you stay alive?
When I came out, I lost the hand of the person I was with, Vivian, and I went running around, and I saw a van that was carrying flowers to the farmer's market, and I jumped in, and I waited there. I don't know how long it was. I was screaming and hysterical, but I realized that if anything happened, I was so close to the building that I had to get away. I jumped out and I ran across the street. There was a police officer there who grabbed my hand and helped me up to where the Brooks Brothers building was. And after that, I just kept running and walking and running.
And that was your instinct to run, and you found yourself actually on the Brooklyn Bridge then, many minutes later.
I ran into my co-worker, Helena, and together we just walked and walked and walked to the Brooklyn Bridge. When we got to the other side, on the Brooklyn side, we both turned around and we saw our building that I was in shortly before just crumbled right before our eyes, and we couldn't believe it, because we have 2 people from my job, Helene, Frank Neistat, and Barbara Gazzardo. They haven't found them yet. They worked in our department.
And I think that's one of the most devastating parts of this tragedy, because so few people know where the thousands of folks are that were working in those towers. You actually emailed friends today to describe to them what went on. Did you do that for catharsis?
There were so many people calling me, and people in tears thinking that I was dead because they saw the building collapse. And it hurt me so much to hear them crying, because they thought I wasn't there anymore. And it was the phones weren't working well, so it was the fastest way to let a lot of people know that I was okay, and to let them know what happened. And that people got out. You know, some of us got out. And there's hope, you know.
One of the things you expressed in this email is your gratitude for that police officer as you were hiding behind that van that somehow had the instinct to tell you, you gotta get out of here, you gotta get out from under this van. Will you ever forget his face?
No. No, I won't forget his face. He ran towards me when I was running towards him, and there were so many people looking and watching, and he just like grabbed me, and you know, he gave me focus to get, you know, away, because otherwise there's so much going on around you, you're not really sure where to go, you know.
You have to feel so lucky as we're standing here tonight.
I'm blessed, and I'm guided by the hand of God, and for so many of us that got downstairs in time to get on that elevator, I truly believe that God has just taken us out of that building, because there's so many who did not make it, and we're truly blessed.
Before we let you go, any thoughts on the heroism that the hundreds of firefighters on duty exhibited, and the police officers, one of whom you said forever will have an impact on your life?
It's really sad, because while we were running away, they were running towards us, and nobody could have known that that was going to happen, that the building was going to collapse. And we pray for them, and we're so appreciative, because without them, we would not have known to just get out as quickly as we did. And I remember police officers saying, head north, get away, when people were standing, and they were just telling us to get away as quickly as possible. And they saved a lot of lives, and we're appreciative.
Well, you certainly represent the triumph of the spirit here in New York. We know this is extremely painful for you to share your story here this evening. We appreciate your coming by, Tricia, and best of luck. Aaron, as you and I both listened to Tricia, I guess the one thing that came to mind today is the amount of gratefulness that New Yorkers have expressed to the firefighters and the rescue workers on duty. At one point tonight, I am told that a couple hundred New Yorkers actually worked their way in within 2 blocks of Ground Zero to thank and cheer on the rescue workers on duty.
I was coming up from the scene down there at about 8 o'clock tonight, and we're coming through Tribeca. We drove by. We were behind a caravan of police and fire officials, and out from a bar or a tavern, I wasn't sure, it went by pretty quickly, a group of people had come out, because this is a street where there's been a tremendous amount of movement of rescue personnel, and they came out and they were holding little votive candles, and they just were holding them out towards the firefighters, the police officers, the assorted rescue workers from not just New York City but all over the area, just to say thanks. They were quiet, there was no whistling, yelling, applauding. It was just this very sweet gesture, and I suspect there were lots of others. Tricia, thanks.
You're welcome.
Thank you. That's really hard. There hasn't been much good news, so let me pass along a little bit. We can tell you that the all clear has been given at both the Empire State Building and at Penn Station, I guess about 20 minutes after an evacuation order was given in those 2 buildings. The all clear has been given, and whatever it was, it's over, it's done, it's fine. Now, a little bit farther downtown from where we are in Washington Square Park, there is, and I think we have pictures of it, there we go, a vigil going on tonight. Washington Square Park's one of the quirkier places in the city. It's a lovely and interesting area, and a fascinating assortment of people gather there every day for all sorts of different reasons.
Quirky is a generous way of describing Washington Park, Aaron.
Quirky is, I like to think of it as a thoughtful way. It doesn't require I explain much more. But there's all sorts of interesting folks down there of all ages and backgrounds, as you see in the city of New York, and they're just down there simply to pray and to stand together, to be together. Being together is one of the things that we as humans like to do in these moments. We share our misery and our sorrow and our anger together, and we pray together, and however we do that, and that's what's going on down in Washington Square Park right now. John Voss is not too terribly far away from there, a correspondent of ours down on the ground, and he can tell us a little bit more about what he has been seeing. John?
Aaron, this has indeed been a very long day for this nation, for this city, but especially for the workers who are on that site, who are on their search and rescue mission, searching for bodies and hoping and praying to rescue people who may still be alive. We spoke with them as they left. They talk of a skittish atmosphere, much like when someone in a theatre jumps up and yells fire. That's the atmosphere down there. They are on a knife's edge. They talk about finding an American flag, pausing for a moment to salute it. They talk about the orange pieces of plastic which marks the spot where they find body parts or bodies, and how when they look on that pile of debris it seems as if there is orange plastic almost every 10 feet. But perhaps the saddest story today we heard from a woman who was walking up and down West Street here. She was carrying photos of a young man She was trying to find him. She'd called all the telephone numbers, she'd called the 1-800 numbers, the hospitals, the police. No one had seen him. No one had seen her nephew.
This is our last resort, to see if there's somebody out there who knows anything about, seeing him or knowing where he's at or seeing him, in the building or whatever, and for them to call us and let us know.
Obviously, great feelings of anxiety, which is shared by so many people in this city and in this nation tonight. Just to add what Brian was telling us about the dump trucks earlier tonight, they are moving in through here. There are hundreds of them. They were banked up. They were lined up all day today. They are going in empty, and they are coming out with debris. We are told they are taking that debris to barges where it is being handed over to the FBI, where they will sift through that debris looking for evidence. Aaron.
John, thank you. John Voss down in the ground zero area, a little 4 or 5 blocks back from it weekend's call.
And Jeff Greenfield has just dropped by to share some of his thoughts on what the president is facing at this moment and what the country will have to endure in the weeks to come.
We were thinking about the president, what he was doing today, and you think back to last year's election, peace and prosperity seemed a fact of nature. We all said there are no big issues on the table. What real issues could a new president have to deal with? Now we know, and a question arises, how have past presidents dealt with crises, and how have those crises defined their presidencies? Political benefit. But when President Johnson escalated the war in Vietnam after an alleged attack on U.S. naval vessels, the resulting firestorm helped drive him into retirement.
When it comes to patriotism,
Richard Nixon had Middle America with him on the war in Vietnam. It was the Watergate scandal, of course, that sunk him.
If Iran should release the hostages.
Jimmy Carter's political defeat in 1980 was sealed by his failure to get American hostages out of Iran. And here's an instructive irony.
Allied air forces began an attack on military targets in Iraq.
President Bush's success in the Gulf War pushed his approval ratings past 90%.
All right.
But the resulting high oil prices and shaken consumer confidence led to a brief but politically fatal recession.
Their legacy must be our lives.
President Clinton, he never looked as presidential as when he led the nation in mourning after the Oklahoma City bombing. But maybe the past doesn't really tell us all that much. I mean, presidents have led us into war, but we've known who the enemy was and what the war was about. We've had presidents console us with losses, but never a loss this enormous and this threatening. So I think what we really can say, much as we look to history for guidance, this president, 9 months into his term, is facing a challenge no other president has ever faced before.
What are your thoughts about what the president had to say today when he toured the area surrounding the Pentagon?
I think everything this president has done and said is what he has to do and say, and it is going to get enormous support from all parts of the political spectrum. The question is not what he says, but what happens in the weeks and months ahead, because this is not a patient nation. And what my point is that this country doesn't always support a president if he doesn't deliver. The piece we didn't see is that Franklin Roosevelt, when he got us into World War II after Pearl Harbor, everybody supported him, but that war was prosecuted successfully. And so the question now is, what happens when people say, you've got to do something, we've got to strike, and then people say, do we really know who to strike at? I think this is an enormous challenge, more complicated maybe than any president's ever faced.
And it strikes me that in an interview I did earlier today with Secretary of State Colin Powell, he is preparing the nation for a long assault. He said this is not going to be over in a week or two. This is going to require the combined efforts of the United States and what he called the world neighborhood or world community.
And look at what happens beyond even military action. Look at what happened just a few moments ago. The nervousness that runs through this country where anybody can make a phone call and evacuate the Empire State Building and Penn Station. What happens when the commercial airlines get back into work and somebody calls, some nut calls in a bomb case? How much more seriously will we take it? How much more disruption? And that's what I mean by the uniqueness of this challenge. This president is facing not simply the need to take military action, not simply an enormous loss of life, but the whole possibility of a ripple of disruption throughout this country. I can't think of a historical parallel to it.
Jeff, thanks.
Okay.
Thank you, Jeff. Around the city of New York today, or tonight, there are literally hundreds of people, perhaps thousands of people in hospitals. They have been taken there over mostly yesterday, early yesterday. They're being treated from injuries that are as simple as scrapes and bruises, and as serious as you can imagine, as life-threatening as you can imagine. The medical correspondent today, Elizabeth Cohen, visited one of them, and here is her report.
Andrew Zucker started his day Tuesday on the 86th floor of the South Tower of the World Trade Center. After the first explosion, the one in the North Tower, his wife called.
And he said, I'm okay, I'll call you back, and he hung up.
But then his building blew up.
If I know Andrew, he stopped to help somebody, and I don't even want to think about what happened, and I don't know what happened to him, but he's just not here.
But thinks she must, because like many people who stood in line to find out about their missing loved ones, Erica says she still thinks her husband may still be alive. So while Erica worked the phones Wednesday, her sister, Naomi Konovich, and family friend Susan Feldman went out on a search, one hospital at a time, starting at New York University Medical Center, where there were no answers.
Bellevue, I think, is on like 27th. It's only like 3 or 4 more blocks down.
After Bellevue, on to Beekman Hospital. No one had seen him there either.
Someone told us actually to go over to the medical examiner's office.
They told Naomi to gather dental records and hair samples in case they'd have to identify his body.
They don't have lists of people who were found dead. They don't have anything.
Late in the day, after buying a mask to keep out the dust circulating after all the explosions, she checked yet more public offices. Still, no one had heard of Andrew Zucker.
They said there were a couple of John Does in the hospital. We're hoping to find that maybe one of them is him.
In the end, a frustrated Naomi distributed flyers to the media.
He's about 6'1", heavy set with the big shoulders and a big chest.
While her sister kept up the round of calls to the hospitals, to the morgue.
If you do see him or you're with him, just tell him we all love him and just to hold in there. And we just want him to come home. We need him to come home.
Elizabeth Cohen, CNN, New York.
An odd or end, if you will. One of our colleagues who lives over in Brooklyn woke up this morning and looked out in his backyard, and scattered about were pieces. We're working off that camera. There we go. Here, hang on to that for me.
You want me to hold that for you?
Yeah, would you please? Thank you. Pieces of scraps of paper that had blown. You can see the edges of them. I hope you can see it, at least the edges of them singed. This comes from Cantor Fitzgerald, one of the investment firms in the World Trade Center. Obviously, when the building blew and the paper flew, it scattered all over the area. It crossed the water and in and over to Brooklyn and into our friend and colleague's backyard today. And I wonder how many people around the area woke up to something like this.
Well, for the first time, we are being told that New Yorkers as far away as 4 miles from here are smelling the stinging smoke that continues to come from what is left of the World Trade Center. I think you made it clear, Aaron, that area continues to be illuminated tonight. You'll just find that over my right shoulder, where rescue workers are still on duty.
When I was down there earlier today, the smell is indescribable, and it is unforgettable. I mean, I hope never again to have it. It's absolutely awful, and I wouldn't even know how to begin to tell you what it smells like. It smells like nothing I've ever experienced, but I know I'll never forget it.
Right now, we'd like to share with you some of the thoughts of Bruce Morton as he focuses in on how the nation will have to continue to come to grips with the magnitude of what has been handed us.
The House will be in order.
Congress went back to work.
Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
people went to church, trying to make sense of it all. God made us free, the homily said, to do good or evil. And people went back to work. In New York, exhausted rescue workers caught their breath. Signs said pray, and surely many did. And some just cried. Major League Baseball canceled all its games for the second straight day. New York's tunnels were closed. Airports looked ghostly. This was Dallas-Fort Worth. The limited flights for stranded people will resume. An odd day for those who work in airports.
I've been here for almost 6 months, and I've never, ever, it's almost peaceful.
In Chicago at the Sears Tower, America's tallest building, it was business as usual. But some who work in it are worried.
And this is the tallest building I ever worked in. Normally the buildings it would go like 21 or maybe 31, but this is the tallest, and I'm terrified.
Newspaper headlines offered a sample of reaction to the terror, pretty straightforward mostly. The San Francisco Examiner was just plain angry. And on talk radio, this is San Francisco's KGO, people, this man said he was an airline pilot, talked.
What more do you need? Do we need to have the Capitol taken out and the joint session of Congress before this thing can turn nuclear? I'm just so furious over it.
Back in Washington, the mall looked empty except for accidental tourists, a stranded Australian.
This is just a terrible thing, and clearly it's a threat to all of us, to our safety, and it's a threat to democracy.
A woman from Topeka wondering how to get home.
Is there a train? I don't even know. We don't have trains in Kansas.
A student.
Just to see so many police officers everywhere. Everywhere you go, National Guards out on some of the streets. It's eerie.
Lots of flags, all at half-staff. Walmart sold 88,000 this day, 6,000 on the same day last year. At the Capitol's railroad station, a sign people could sign, and did. And a street musician playing a bugle call he probably hadn't played in years. Sadness and tiredness, back to work, still grieving, but determined. Bruce Morton, CNN, Washington.
And one more image for you tonight. Tomorrow, many of you will find on your newsstand a very rare special edition of Time magazine. That is the cover shot. There are, at least as when I saw it on my computer, now I'm not so sure. There are no words, there's no strung slug on it, just the date. It is not since August of '98 during the Lewinsky matter has Time published a special edition. They'll publish again on Monday, as they always do, but they put that out, and that picture, I guess, is the one that I will confess I took to sleep with me last night.
I think we all did.
Yeah.
I think it's forever burned into our consciousness here. Aaron Brown and I both thank you for joining us tonight. That wraps it up for us this evening. Garrick Utley, Colleen McEdwards, and Jim Clancy will take you through the next hour. We, again, appreciate your joining us tonight. Good night.
Yeah.
A day after the stunning attacks on America, a sense of determination as New York City confronts the horror of Tuesday's terrorist attacks.
While investigators follow a trail of clues along the United States East Coast, searching for those responsible for the devastation.
And around the world, outpourings of grief for the victims and expressions of solidarity with the United States. Hello and welcome. I'm Jim Clancy.
And I'm Colleen McEdwards at the CNN Center. We want to bring you right up to date on the latest developments, of course, for you right here. Authorities in New York Wednesday evening evacuated 2 of the city's landmarks. They told people to leave both the Empire State Building and Penn Station. It's not clear yet why New York authorities took this action, but the all clear, we can tell you, was given just about 30 minutes ago. We'll continue to monitor that. Meanwhile, with their hands, with pickaxes, with whatever they can grab, rescuers dig slowly through the mounds of rubble, searching for survivors and human remains. At times, they're forced to retreat when sections of surrounding buildings buckle and crack. That actually happened Wednesday when what's left of the South Tower of the World Trade Center completely collapsed, as did 5 World Trade Center. Despite their efforts, only 9 survivors have been pulled from the wreckage so far. Still, firefighters, though, work on.
It's a lot of devastation, but we have to deal with it. It's something that we have to do. I mean, nobody really prepares for anything on this kind of scale. And, every news we hear is just more and more bad news.
In New York, leaders warn that the death toll from the collapse of the Twin Towers is sure to be heavy. Many people did manage to get out, but authorities fear that thousands remain under the piles of metal, stone, and dust. New York's mayor and governor appear undaunted.
We have to all work together now and work together to make sure that we save as many lives as possible, rescue the people that we can rescue, and rebuild the city of New York and the World Trade Center to be even greater and more wonderful and more beautiful than it was before.
We're going to show the rest of the nation, we're going to show the rest of the world that the New Yorkers are not intimidated by terrorism, that we don't surrender to this type of cowardly act, but we will come back stronger than ever.
And citywide, Mayor Giuliani says that the death toll officially standing at 82, expected, though, of course, to go much higher.
At the same time this day, U.S. President George W. Bush taking a close-up view of the devastation at the Pentagon for himself. Mr. Bush made the short trip to the sprawling building just outside Washington Wednesday. After meeting with rescue personnel, he stared silently at the huge gash left by the plane's impact.
Coming here makes me sad on the one hand. It also makes me angry. And our country will, however, not be cowed by terrorists, by people who don't share the same values we share, by people who are willing to destroy people's lives.
As Mr. Bush stood nearby, workers unfurled a large American flag and began singing, "God Bless America." Now on to one of the areas of this story people are most interested in, the investigation. No arrests yet, but in Boston, the FBI taking several people in for questioning. Boston is a focus for investigators because 2 of the 4 hijacked commercial flights originated there. Agents have also taken into custody several people in Providence, Rhode Island, as well as Venice and Vero Beach, Florida. Authorities searched 2 residents in Vero Beach, where they say 2 brothers possibly involved in the hijackings may have lived.
The Department of Justice has undertaken perhaps the most massive and intensive investigation ever conducted in America. The full resources of the FBI, the Justice Department's Criminal Division, the U.S. Attorney's offices, the INS, and other components have been brought to bear and will be focused in this endeavor.
The Bush administration still considering how to respond to the terror attacks. President Bush huddled with his national security team Wednesday. Pressure building on the Bush administration to strike back and strike back soon. But top aides say the battle against terrorism will take a long-term commitment from the entire world.
We're building a strong coalition to go after these perpetrators, but more broadly, to go after terrorism wherever we find it in the world. It's a scourge not only against the United States, but against civilization, and it must be brought to an end.
U.S. military advisors are refusing to provide any details of whether a military strike is being planned, but Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld warning U.S. servicemen and women to be on the alert.
We are, in a sense, seeing the definition of a new battlefield in the world, a 21st century battlefield. And it is a different kind of conflict. It is something that is not unique to this century, to be sure, but it is, given our geography and given our circumstance, it is in a major sense new for this country.
Now, at the same time, Colleen, congressional leaders are telling CNN lawmakers and the White House have begun work on a so-called use of force resolution. But they add several key leaders are raising concerns that the measure could be seen as a blank check authorizing military action.
International support key as well here, and President Bush and his top aides also spent much of the day trying to line up international support for the U.S. response to the attacks, and they did get a good deal of it. At an emergency meeting in Brussels, NATO made a decision that could pave the way for a collective response to the carnage.
On September the 12th, the North Atlantic Council met again in response to the appalling attacks perpetrated yesterday against the United States of America. The Council agreed that if it is determined that this attack was directed from abroad against the United States, it shall be regarded as an action covered by Article 5 of the Washington Treaty, which states that an armed attack against one or more of the allies in Europe or in North America shall be considered an attack against them all.
And NATO's decision marks the first time in the 52-year history of the alliance that the Mutual Defense Clause has actually been invoked. Meantime, Germany says it wants to repay the United States for its past support.
When the freedom of Berlin was at stake, John F. Kennedy said, you know the famous sentence, Ich bin ein Berliner. That was the expression of an incredible solidarity. Today, I think we have reason, especially as Germans, to return this show of solidarity. We stand in solidarity with the American people.
The U.S. financial markets are going to remain closed until at least Friday. The leaders of the New York Stock Exchange, the NASDAQ, and the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission cite the destruction in downtown Manhattan for that delay. However, the U.S. Treasury will resume trading on Thursday. Meantime, thousands of travelers are waiting for commercial air travel to actually get going again. Federal officials have announced the limited resumption of commercial flights, but they say they need more time to put strict new security measures into effect. They include a total ban on knives and an end to curbside and off-airport check-ins. Also, only ticketed passengers with photo ID will be allowed past airport metal detectors, done that way in several other countries. Aviation officials say they don't expect passenger travel to return to normal before Thursday evening Eastern time. That is at the earliest, we're told. Jim?
Now, even at this moment, a day and a half or more after that first jetliner slammed into the World Trade Center, the full story of the attack on the United States is really only beginning to take shape. We now have stories of survival. We have stories of struggle. CNN's Gary Cutley joins us once again, surveying the skyline of a wounded city. Garrick.
Indeed, Jim, it is still a wounded city. New York City, particularly Manhattan here around us, has begun to come back halfway to life this afternoon and even this evening. Mayor Giuliani and others are predicting that by tomorrow life should be as normal as it can be, except for the lower part of the island there along New York Harbor where the attack took place. And as we try to still handle and absorb the shocks of the attack itself on Tuesday, there are the aftershocks, perhaps not so surprisingly, fears of new bomb attacks. In fact, false alarms, perhaps even hoaxes. One of these occurred just right below us here along 34th Street in Midtown Manhattan this evening. A bomb alert or warning was received by security officials, and suddenly 34th Street, a busy crosstown thoroughfare, was the scene of all kinds of police and fire department action. The units were brought in, the cars and pedestrians were cleared out from almost the Hudson River to on the west to Madison Avenue on the east. That's where securing the area around the Empire State Building. And not only the Empire State Building, but also nearby Penn Station, one of the main transportation hubs in Manhattan. The alert was also valid for that center. Passengers are not only rushed out of the terminal, some passengers, we are told, were told to get out of their trains and flee. But after about 1 hour, it was indeed a false alarm, and 34th Street is being reopened to traffic once again. And perhaps it's not surprising that these kinds of hoaxes, some kinds of people with these ideas will be calling these in. Of course, the police have to respond, which makes it much more difficult for them to deal with the real trouble and tragedy further downtown. And downtown is our correspondent Michael Oku, who has a vantage point near where the World Trade Centers once stood and can tell us what's going on there, how the rescue efforts are proceeding. Michael?
Garrett, good evening. As you can see, I am standing in front of what used to be the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center. If you look over my shoulder, you will see that it's now just a very, very blooming cloud of smoke. You can smell some of the remnants. People say that it's material, obviously, that came from the building and from some of the smoke down on the ground level. There are helicopters flying overhead. One must imagine that They have to do with the rescue efforts, and some of the authorities are surveying the scene here. Mayor Giuliani, as you correctly said, has said that tomorrow life will go back to normal, but he has said it is still pretty much a state of emergency south of 14th Street in Lower Manhattan. The police barricades that had stretched all across 14th Street, which basically divides Lower Manhattan from the rest of the city. He also mentioned what are some very grim numbers. When you talk about stories like this, you will always talk about the numbers, and we will be talking about the numbers for the weeks ahead. As we mentioned earlier in the broadcast, Colleen mentioned 82 victims found, 18 of which have been identified. So you can do the quick arithmetic on that. That means, of course, grimly, that 64 bodies have not been identified. It's unclear whether any of those bodies or all of those bodies will ever be identified. Of course, that's speculation at this point. We will get, hopefully, clearer information on that in the days ahead. And also very difficult to digest, but unfortunately, a harsh reality in a story like this. Authorities at the scene at the mayor's press conference today, after the press conference, told me that also 37 body parts were found. New York City Mayor Rudolph Giuliani confirmed tonight that the city has requested 6,000 body bags from FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, and that 3,000 tons of debris had been found from the site. Again, very grim numbers, and I'm sure that we will continue talking about those numbers in the days ahead. Garrett?
Thank you very much, Michael. As the rescue work continues, we're also receiving new images, new scenes of what was happening at the time, shortly after the explosion. And these are pictures of the downtown area, some of the rescue efforts that were taking place, some of the looks like a bulldozer there trying to move an ambulance or a police department vehicle. These are some of the efforts. It's not just the rubble up from the buildings itself, but we see again the destruction. This again an amateur video which was made today and courtesy of Mr. Bauer, who took them. Again, it shows part of the mosaic, the destruction there. And as we have been seeing over and hearing over the last day or two, there have been any number of stories from those who were in the Twin Towers at the World Trade Center when those two planes crashed into them. And in addition to the stories of how they escaped, there's another angle, there's another important element. What led these people to flee? And what led apparently a great number of workers in the Twin Towers to stay exactly where they were once those planes crashed into the building, into the World Trade Center? How did they make these decisions, and why did they? That's part of the report now from our correspondent, Maria Hinojosa.
The onlookers, safe behind police barricades, release their emotions through applause for the rescue workers. But for the survivors who were closer to ground zero, mixed emotions.
I saw my family, my wife and the two kids, baby that's 1 year old and the 4-year-old. And I just saw them and I was just running towards the light.
Benjamin Fogel was right outside the building when it imploded. So survivors come to terms with what gave them the strength to make it out.
The plane is making impact. It's just coming in, and it's like shattered glass. Multiply the sum by 1 billion.
Judith Francis escaped through some back door steps.
And you're like, don't look back, don't look up. Just keep going, don't run. It felt like a thunder of elephants just coming.
Many survivors spent yesterday in shock. Today, for some, that shock gave way to anger.
If I made it from 105th floor, many, many more people could have made it down. And Port Authority was announcing over the speaker over and over again, everything is fine, we are secure.
In the wreckage, she may have lost dozens of co-workers.
People had a chance to get out. And people went and sat back down and went up to get their purse and went back, for silly things.
Downtown near Ground Zero, Maureen Raffoni tries to make it to her apartment just 1 block away from where the tower stood, with no luck.
So you're looking at not going home for 2 or 3 days?
She feels guilty these days for everything.
You don't want to be narcissistic, you know, and be like, oh, my belongings, oh, my apartment is trashed. You know, the reality is I'm alive, you know, and those poor people that didn't get out, I just pray for them.
As the rescue workers file in, hoping against hope for more survivors, those who did make it through move into numbness.
I mean, I can't find words to describe it anymore. It's just the pain that I feel inside. I can't really label it.
For the survivors, theirs is a gift of life, but it's a gift wrapped in pain and sorrow. How could they have survived when so many others didn't? Maria Hinojosa, CNN, New York.
And once again, that eternal question of why, and for many, the question of why did I decide to flee, or why did I decide to stay? Questions being asked by so many people, above all the loved ones, the family and friends of those who were lost or at least are trapped at the World Trade Center site. Back to you now in Atlanta, Jim.
Garrick, just to chat with you a little bit and ask you, you know, we see there the obvious pain, the wonderment at having survived such a disaster. But we also saw this day a lot of resolve on the part of New Yorkers, a band of people that, more than perhaps many others around the world, have a tendency to stick together in times of challenge.
That's true, and of course there's been this popular image of the tough New Yorker, the can-do New Yorker, at times rather obnoxious perhaps, but that's supposed to be this metropolis's characteristic. And one of the reasons for it is the sheer density of this city, particularly for an American city. Manhattan, the center of New York City, obviously, is an island. There are bridges going out on the Hudson River, the East River. People really live here in dormitory living. We live in cubicles and cells, if you will. And if you're going to live that close together, two things happen, Jim. One is you run up against each other and you become very abrasive. On the other hand, you realize that you are part of a community. There's no big backyard. There's no backyard fence or a driveway separating your place from the next place, like much of American suburbia, for example. And I think this goes a long way to explaining why people in New York City, particularly here in Manhattan, stick together, work together, and that's what they're continuing to do tonight and obviously for many days ahead.
All right, Gary Cutler, thank you for that. Colleen.
All right, Jim. Well, CNN has learned that a microphone was actually left open on the hijacked flight that crashed in rural Pennsylvania, and we have obtained a partial transcript of what air traffic ground control heard taking place inside that cockpit. While United Airlines Flight 93 is 35,000 feet over the Cleveland area, shouting is heard in that cockpit. Someone yells, "Get out of here." The microphone's turned off. It comes back on. Some scuffling is heard, and a voice again yells, "Get out of here." The microphone again turned off, and then when it's turned on once again, someone is heard speaking English in what is described to us as an Arabic accent, tells passengers this: "There is a bomb on board. This is the captain speaking. Remain in your seat. There is a bomb on board. Stay quiet. We are meeting their demands. We are returning to the airport." And the microphone then goes off as the doomed plane heads into Pittsburgh airspace. That into CNN. Well, the Federal Bureau of Investigation is conducting a massive operation throughout the U.S. The FBI Wednesday took several people into custody in Boston and Florida for questioning. Now, these people have not been arrested, or they're not even being described as suspects at this point, but authorities say that they could provide what they call important material information related to the attacks. Meanwhile, the FBI says it believes at least 4 hijackers were capable of flying a plane. CNN's Mike Betcher has more on that.
From Maine to Florida, the investigation moved quickly along the eastern seaboard.
We have, in the last 24 hours, taken the manifests and used those as an evidentiary base, and have talked to many of the families of the victims, and have successfully, I believe, identified many of the hijackers on each of the 4 flights that went down.
Federal investigators now believe they know the identity of 4 men capable of piloting the 2 planes that left Boston and crashed into the World Trade Center. The key, rental cars parked by the suspected terrorist at Portland International Airport and Boston's Logan Airport, each yielding clues that ultimately led investigators to flight schools in Florida.
A number of the suspected hijackers were trained as pilots in the United States.
rental records for the car left in Portland brought investigators to residences in Vero Beach, Florida, which were searched by the FBI. Inside one house, pictures of Adnan Bukhari and a pilot certificate from a Florida flight school in his name. Also found inside the residence, another pilot certificate for Amir Abbas Bukhari. Another certificate indicates that at least one of the Bukharis participated in a program to help train Saudi Airlines employees. Federal investigators believe the two men are brothers and prime suspects. FBI agents also visited other Florida locations after gathering clues from the second rental car parked at Boston's Logan Airport that led to the identity of two more men, also pilots, Mohammed Atta and Marwan Youssef Al-Shehi, who received at least some flight training at Huffman Aviation in Venice, Florida. Charles Voss is a bookkeeper at Huffman Aviation who briefly allowed the two men to stay at his house.
They were, like I said, students, and they arrived over there a year ago. It was in last July. And when they first arrived, they had no place to stay. They just popped in pretty much, as I recall, unannounced. And so we provided them, for the benefit of the flight school, provided them a place to stay for a few days.
At least one person believed to be an acquaintance of the Bukharis has been taken into custody for questioning.
There have been occasions where we have interviewed individuals and come to find that the individual is out of status and that individual has been detained on an immigration hold. But there have been no arrests relating to these hijackings at this point.
Having found the four men, federal investigators believe piloted the two hijacked jets into the World Trade Center towers. They are now scouring Florida flight schools, searching for the pilots of the other two jetliners, one that crashed in Pennsylvania, the other that rammed the Pentagon. Mike Betcher, CNN, Atlanta.
Congress and the White House are weighing their options on how to respond to Tuesday's attack. CNN's John King is covering this story from the White House. He joins us now live. John.
Jim, negotiations proceeding and progress being made, we are told, on two fronts. First and foremost, CNN getting details tonight of negotiations between the White House and key congressional leaders on what they are calling a resolution of resolve. But this resolution, we are told, includes language, and again, they're still negotiating the final document, but it includes language that would back the president in using force to retaliate for these deadly terrorist strikes. The negotiations went on late tonight, the White House faxing at some points proposed language to key members of Congress. We're told those talks will pick up in the morning. The president also making progress, we are told, in negotiating agreement on a $20 billion emergency spending bill. That could reach the White House as early as tomorrow afternoon. That would be a down payment on the money to pay first and foremost for the recovery and rescue efforts we see in New York and over at the Pentagon, and to pay for the early stages of the investigation. Jim?
Through the last years, there's been a sense that there's a terrorist threat that is looming there, and certainly the Bush administration has talked about that with its missile defense and everything else. It has pushed sanctions, diplomatic pressure, and other things. Is there a sense at the White House that the clock has run out on some of these options?
There certainly is, and again, there's both a short-term and a long-term prescription. Looking far down the road, we hear administration officials and especially key members of Congress saying the United States needs to go back to the drawing board, learn some lessons from this, find out what went wrong, and perhaps spend billions more not only on tougher airport security, but on human intelligence at the CIA, at the FBI, and at other law enforcement agencies. In the short term, Mr. Bush now trying to do something his father did when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait. Mr. Bush called more than a half dozen international leaders today. Secretary of State Colin Powell making efforts as well, trying to form what the White House is calling a broad international coalition against terrorism, hoping not only to have broad international support if and when the president decides to respond to these particular attacks, but also White House officials saying hopefully to bring some good from this catastrophe to create a sustained effort to go after suspected terrorists with military force if necessary, but also to get nations around the world to crack down and shun other nations that provide harbor or financial support to suspected terrorist groups. Jim?
You spoke earlier about some of the technicalities of obtaining the permission for the use of military force. How much coordination, how much support is there for the president? Are there sticking points?
Well, there are always sticking points whenever there is a proposal or a prospect of using force, some in the Congress believe that Congress has to authorize it. The commander-in-chief always defends presidential prerogative, that he is the commander-in-chief and that the president can act to use force. So what the president hopes for here is to get language backing him, authorizing the use of force. He does not want to go to the Congress and say he needs the permission of the Congress, but what he would like, not only to show the American people there is broad bipartisan support for this, but to show other nations around the world that there is unity in the United States on this point. He would like, much like the Congress unanimously passed a resolution today condemning these acts, much like President Bush, the former President Bush, won support for his actions against Saddam Hussein. This president would like the United States Congress to be on record saying, Mr. President, if you come to a conclusive conclusion about who is responsible for this, please use force and retaliate.
All right, John King reporting there live from the White House. Colleen.
Jim, well, President Bush got a first-hand look Wednesday at the devastating blow suffered by the Pentagon, the site of the third terrorist strike. And for that story now, we turn to CNN's Jamie McIntyre, who's there for us. Jamie?
Colleen, President Bush did come by here at the Pentagon about 5:30 this afternoon to take a look at the huge gaping hole that was left when that American Airlines jetliner slammed into the side of the Pentagon. He thanked many of the firefighters and rescue workers and FBI agents personally for the hard work that they've been doing over the last 2 days. And as sort of a moment of high symbolism, some of the firefighters and other workers unfurled a huge American flag from the roof of the Pentagon, hung it down over the front of the facade as a symbol that they had gotten the fire under control and that the Pentagon was continuing to work as usual. But even though the firefighters finally did get that fire under control, they are now pretty much giving up hope of finding any more survivors.
There are still some smoldering embers in the rubble that was once the Navy wedge of the Pentagon, seen here in a commercial satellite photograph. But after more than 24 hours, the fire was basically out. The intense heat and smoky blaze that resulted from a fully fueled jetliner crashing into the building convinced Pentagon officials that anyone who might have survived the initial impact could not have survived the fire. The death toll, feared to be as high as 800, now looks as though it may be just over 200, including the 64 people on the plane.
From everything that we currently know, the estimate that's been widely reported is considerably high, and we certainly pray that that's the case.
The attack penetrated 3 of the Pentagon's 5 rings, and the fire spread through the wooden roof. For now, roughly 1/2 of the Pentagon is closed, sealed off by armed sentries posted at all 5 rings on all 5 floors. Now the search is for evidence. FBI agents lined up to slowly comb the area, looking for pieces of plane wreckage. It will take months, if not years, to repair the damage to the Pentagon. And thousands of Pentagon workers, including the chiefs of the Army and Navy, have been relocated to temporary offices. In a recorded message to U.S. troops, Secretary Rumsfeld again hinted military retaliation is coming.
It is my duty as head of this department to tell you that more, much more, will be asked of you in the weeks and months ahead. This is especially true of those who are in the field. We face powerful and terrible enemies, enemies we intend to vanquish, so that moments of horror, like yesterday, will be stopped.
So far, the only military deployments are defensive. An aircraft carrier off the coast of New York is one of dozens of ships patrolling the east and west coasts. Air National Guard planes are flying protective cover over major U.S. cities.
Rumsfeld warned that a military campaign against terrorists and their supporters will be neither quick nor easy. It will take, he said, a sustained and broadly based effort. Will it work, he was asked? His reply, only time will tell. Colleen?
All right, CNN's Jamie McIntyre at the Pentagon tonight. Thanks. Jim?
Attorney General John Ashcroft calls the probe into Tuesday's attacks the most massive and intensive investigation in American history. As David Inser reports, U.S. officials apparently have already made some significant progress.
U.S. officials say on the passenger manifests of the hijacked planes used in the attacks, they found names associated with terrorist groups. Intelligence officials say the evidence still points to the al-Qaeda group, headed by Osama bin Laden.
there had to be some brains behind this. We have some good, promising leads. They're obviously being followed.
Publicly, the Bush administration is accusing no one so far, while warning nations they too will pay for any help given to those who attacked New York and Washington.
We will hold accountable those countries that provide support, that give host nation, if you can call it that, support and facilities to these kinds of terrorist groups.
Afghanistan's Taliban government has long offered haven to bin Laden, but U.S. officials say they have no evidence thus far of any state directly assisting the attacks in New York and Washington. Many analysts argue that such a coordinated broadside could not have been possible without it.
Osama bin Laden represents a complete terrorist network. He will have one or more state sponsors, countries that he's either based in or working in collusion with. There'll have been passport support, communication support.
One thing I think that ought to make us a bit suspicious about whether bin Laden was involved in it alone or not is that he goes to great lengths to advertise himself. And when you see something like that, you begin to wonder whether or not there may be an effort to draw our attention solely to him, to the neglect of someone who may be his principal contractor.
If there was state support, a number of terrorism experts point to Iraq as the most likely suspect. A statement from President Saddam Hussein on Iraqi television said, quote, "The United States reaps the thorns that its rulers have sown in the world."
U.S. officials say they are developing good law enforcement and intelligence leads. They do not know yet who was behind these attacks, nor whether any state assisted them. But they believe they soon will. David Ensor, CNN, Washington.
The Justice Department's Office of Victims of Crime has set up a hotline. We've got some numbers for you now. For tips that may help thwart terrorist acts, you can call 800-483-5137. Families and relatives of those who are missing since the attack can call this number, 1-800-331-0075. Well, Wall Street remained closed Wednesday, but trading is currently underway in Asia. Maggie Lake is in our New York bureau with the latest numbers from Asian trading. A heck of a sell-off yesterday, Maggie. Has it stabilized at all today?
Colleen, there are some early, very encouraging signs. Obviously, global markets are still grappling with the devastation that rocked the U.S. on Tuesday. In particular, Wall Street, the financial nerve center of the U.S. Asian markets, as you said, are now open. And as I said, early indications show some modest gains across the board. It's a big relief. Yesterday, Asian markets fell sharply. Tokyo's Nikkei dropped over 6.5%, its lowest close since December 1983. The Hang Seng in Hong Kong declined 8.8%. That was its lowest close since 1999. But of course, they were the first to react to the unbelievable news of the attack on New York and Washington. Europe had a little bit more time to digest it and was able to push higher. That helped shore up sentiment, and today may indeed lend some support to Asian markets. If we take a look right now how those markets are trading, after a 30-minute delay at the Nikkei, this is the second day in a row we've seen that, it is actually just turned down. It was positive at the very open, it's down, but just fractionally. The Hong Kong Hang Seng is trading up more than 1%, and the Singapore Straits Times also trading up just marginally. Of course, the decision had already been made that U.S. equity markets will remain closed on Thursday. The destruction and actual infrastructure challenges are behind the decision.
The operational readiness of individual firms, as Harvey has said, we've examined the issues of communication, power, safety and soundness of structures in the lower Manhattan area, and certainly access to those structures for the people who operate our firms. We are committed that the equity markets will resume operations no later than Monday. The group that gathered today will gather again tomorrow, with the idea that we may well be in a position to resume trading as early as Friday.
Many analysts and market participants are really driving that point home today. That is not concerned about the stability of markets, but rather logistics that are behind the delay. They feel it is a very important distinction to make. Well, we've all seen the pictures. The destruction is immense, and no one knows that better than Morgan Stanley Dean Witter. They were the largest tenant in the World Trade Center, 3,500 employees spread out on 22 floors. Many miraculously have been accounted for, but the search still continues, and obviously the offices are decimated. Despite this, the company's CEO has come out and said they will be open for business.
All of the financial systems internally and externally are working. So the country is strong. The financial system is very strong and resilient, and your company is extremely strong and very proud of its people. Bob?
Now, if you wonder how it's possible, many companies have disaster contingency plans in place. Many of them were actually shored up with the approach of Y2K and fears of the millennium bug. IBM, SunGard, and ComDisco are the three biggest players in that area. They have systems that replicate data and files, and they kick in and take over when something like this hits. ComDisco, for one, today saying it is handling operations for about 30 clients. In a way, many are saying now that the non-event of Y2K was maybe the best thing that ever happened. It helped cause these kinds of safeguards to be put in place and tested. Of course, financial regulators also urging this, and it's paid off, certainly. Now, it is important to stress many of the companies are rolling up their sleeves in the face of enormous personal loss, and it is not just in New York. Across the country, the financial community has lost colleagues and friends, but the response has been the same. Brokers and fund managers were in work today. Bank of America, which had offices in the World Trade Center, A.G. Edwards, the list goes on. All of them hit the phones, talking to clients, to investors, answering their questions, telling them to have patience and not to panic. Also, we've seen an incredible show of solidarity, and not by those directly that were not impacted. Amazon.com turned over its homepage to the American Red Cross to accept donations. GE has said it will donate $10 million. Cisco donated $4 million, both to the rebuilding and rescue efforts. Bank America donated $1 million to the September 11th fund, which helps the victims. Also, banks Wells Fargo and Wachovia are donating, and I'm sure that list will continue to grow in the days ahead. Colleen?
Maggie, there have been reports of talk of price gouging. What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, that's right. Today there were some reports, mostly coming from the Midwest, of isolated cases of what seems to be individual gas station owners bumping up the price of gasoline, sometimes to as much as $4 or $5 a gallon. It was sort of a knee-jerk reaction. The oil companies, including ExxonMobil, immediately came out and said they were holding prices steady. Some of the station owners actually said in the wake of that they would give rebates to customers they overcharged, and the Automobile Association of America urged against exploiting the situation.
Consumers should not panic. They should remain calm. Our supplies are fine at this point. There's no need to form long gas lines and thinking that our supplies are going to run out.
In New York City, there were also some reports of price gouging, but again, they seem to be the exception. I have to say, I have been in and around the city for the last 2 days. I live here, and what I have seen has been just the opposite. People were giving out free pizza to people who were stranded yesterday, offering cars to people who needed transport, giving out free water. I was in the grocery store today. The prices were normal. People were orderly. Restaurants were keeping their doors open. So it seems that these are very isolated cases in what is a very difficult situation. Colleen?
Maggie, in comments earlier by Mayor Rudy Giuliani seeming to support that, saying things are going well, not a lot of looting, not a lot of problems. So thanks very much for your report. Jim?
All right, Colleen, let's turn our attention once again to the streets of New York. Our Garrick Utley is there, and we'll take his view. Garrick?
Well, Jim, we want to check up on something that's been happening in Lower Manhattan around the site of the disaster all day and into the night. A rather nervous waiting and watching game as to whether yet another building may collapse there. This one, of course, is at One Liberty Plaza near the site of the Twin Towers. We want to speak now with the president and CEO of Brookfield Properties, Bruce Flatt. That's the company which owns the building. Good evening, Mr. Flatt. What can you tell us about the status, the safety, the integrity of your building tonight?
Firstly, what I'd like to say is most of the reports that have been reported on the news are wrong, and how that information got out, we don't know. But we've been working with authorities, including the mayor's office and the governor's office, for the last 2 days since this started. We've had, since early this morning, engineers and people in One Liberty Plaza and in the World Financial Center downtown, which are our properties. And we've done preliminary technical work and investigation with structural engineers, and we have no structural damage in the buildings, including One Liberty Plaza. So
well, tell us,
sir. Hello?
Please, yes, Mr. Flatt, can I just ask you to get some specifics? Give us an idea of how high is this building? How many floors? What's the size?
Jerry Larkin's telling me it's 54 stories, and it is 2.2 million square feet. It's a large building, but I spent personally 3 hours in the building today. We had all of our senior people down there, including the former First Deputy Mayor, John Zuccotti, and we were through the building. We've had structural engineers, in fact, 2 firms through the building, including the fire department, who's given it. We've talked to them and let people back into the buildings, and there are no issues with the building at the current time. And there's been no partial collapses reported on the newscast.
So the structural.
The thing that we're worried about, firstly, is people, and secondly, which is our tenant. And what I'd like to say to our tenants is that there is no issues as reported on the news in the last.
All right, thank you very much, Mr. Flatt, for being with us and giving us that update on the structural integrity of your building there at One Liberty Plaza. Throughout the day, of course, we've been hearing statements from the Bush administration that when the investigation does pinpoint who or which organizations were responsible for these terrorist attacks, the United States will take direct and immediate action, unilateral action. The United States will do what it deems fit and proper as a response. And yet, of course, there is also the wider international community. Now, leaders of various nations, as we've heard, have been supporting the United States, expressing their official sympathy. Here in New York City, of course, we have the headquarters of the United Nations. What does the UN as a symbol of the international community think? What are the legal ramifications with me? And joining us this evening here in New York is Shashi Tharoor, who is the head of the Public Information Office at the UN. Thank you very much for joining us. First of all, what has the United Nations done in terms of taking an official position vis-a-vis what happened here in Lower Manhattan?
It's reacted immediately, first of all, with the Secretary General's condemnation as soon as it happened, and the Security Council's action. Today, both the Security Council and the General Assembly, today Wednesday, adopted unanimous resolutions expressing horror and revulsion at what had happened and pledging to assist the United States to bring the perpetrators to justice. In fact, when the Security Council voted in an unprecedented gesture, the members of the Council stood up instead of raising their hands to vote. It was an act that symbolized the world standing together standing behind the United States.
These words, these resolutions, of course, are very encouraging, very supportive. But when it comes to the action itself, one of the key issues President Bush has raised in the speech in the White House the other night is that we, that is the Americans, the United States, will not distinguish between the terrorist groups themselves and any government which might be harboring or sheltering these terrorist groups. Now, obviously, everybody's talking about Afghanistan. What is the United Nations' position on this? Do you make a distinction?
Well, every single government of the United Nations is behind these 2 resolutions. The Security Council and the General Assembly have both spoken with one voice, and that simply means that these people, these perpetrators, have no place to hide. There is no government on earth that is prepared to say that it is willing to shelter these people. We come from every part of the world of the United Nations, but we are all New Yorkers today.
So if the investigation leads to conclusive evidence or credible evidence that this was Osama bin Laden's organization, that it is located in Afghanistan, and the White House decides to go after Afghanistan, that would be appropriate action in the UN's view based on these resolutions?
Well, the Security Council has expressed its readiness to take its responsibilities under the Charter, its responsibilities for peace and security, and take all necessary steps in this regard, which does mean, it seems to me, that if the United States were to come with evidence and ask the Security Council to support certain kinds of action, it's bound to get a very sympathetic hearing.
Finally, perhaps a bottom line opinion as to what the United Nations thinks of the situation in Afghanistan. What is the status of your personnel there? We understand that they're being pulled out.
We have pulled our people out of Afghanistan. It's a situation which in any case has been rather fraught. Independent of anything related to this tragedy, we have, as you know, had war going on, explosions in Kabul recently. We judged it was not safe for our personnel to remain, and we have pulled them out.
Americans, I think, and people around the world have heard voices for many years coming from the United Nations in crises such as this, conflicts such as this, not as a diplomat, but as a man who's Indian, lived in Europe, the United Kingdom, here in the United States these days. How do you react to this personally, as a senior official at the UN?
Not just as a senior official, but as somebody who's lived in New York, I grieve with my fellow New Yorkers. All of us feel very, very deeply the pain that this city has suffered. For us, this is not just a blow on New York, not just an attack on America. It's an attack on the bonds of humanity that unite us all. And certainly no one of the United Nations would have anything but the strongest rejection of what has happened here.
Shashi Tharoor with the United Nations, thank you for joining us this evening. That's it now from New York, and back to Colleen.
Garrick, thanks very much. Well, U.S. medical officials say that massive voluntary donations have provided enough blood for the victims of the attack at this point. But remember that blood can only be kept stored for no more than 42 days, so more may be needed in 2 to 8 weeks. If you are willing to donate blood, please contact the Red Cross at 1-888-HELP-NOW. There's the number for you. Well, at some places, people waited in line for hours just to give blood right across the country. Bonnie Anderson reports now from a donation center in Atlanta.
A day of compassion and patriotism. American flags for American citizens reaching out to aid injured countrymen.
Like many Americans, I just wanted to come out and do something and give back in a very tangible way.
I'll take the next person in line, please. On an average day, 10 people walk into Life South Community Center in Atlanta. Since the attacks, hundreds have come, responding to a local radio station's call for help and experiencing a broad range of emotion.
I have family up there. It was hard to get in touch with everybody, and scared that it could happen anywhere. Very scared.
Exhausted staff members working as much as 14 hours a day, inspired by the crowds.
I've been tired, but yet they have been spending about 5-6 hours waiting to give some blood. So I get my encouragement from them.
Go ahead and put pressure there for me. Hold your arms straight up in the air. And people are just willing to donate today. That's great that they're coming out.
This means a lot of work for you.
Yeah, but we enjoy it. It's definitely going to a good cause.
It takes 24 hours to process the blood. At that point, it could go to New York, Washington, D.C., or to any hospital nationwide accepting victims of the attacks. For Karen Skidmore, that chance to save a life made this visit to a blood center even more meaningful.
This is my first time. I'm sorry, this is just really emotional for me. And I just wanted to do something, and this is all I could think of that I could do, other than pray. So.
Bonnie Anderson, CNN, Atlanta.
Let's turn our attention now to the situation in the skies over the United States. Commercial air travel resuming in the United States, but only on a very limited basis. Authorities decided to allow some flights so that stranded airline passengers would be allowed to return to their homes. The Transportation Secretary Norman Mineta says the general ground stop should continue at least until the airports are able to implement new security measures. Officials want to implement a total ban on knives, including plastic ones. Only butter knives will be allowed for in-flight meals. There will be no more curbside check-in or check-ins at sites away from the airport. Only ticketed passengers will be allowed past airport metal detectors. The government wants to set higher standards for airport security personnel and put more federal air marshals on duty at large airports. Well, for many travelers, the effects of the airline ground stop were immediate, and they are still being felt. Thousands of air passengers remain stranded at airports, often in unfamiliar cities. All 4 of the hijacked aircraft were originally destined for California. And that's where we find CNN's Frank Buckley. He's at the Los Angeles International Airport, in other lingo, LAX. Frank?
Jim, we are at a still deserted and closed LAX in Los Angeles, a very eerie sight here at an airport that is very busy. On a normal day, some 160,000 passengers will either fly in or out of LAX. Today, not a single passenger was allowed to fly in or out of this airport. This evening, however, we did encounter some passengers off-site at an off-site parking lot. They arrived by bus. These were passengers who flew in from Osaka, Japan yesterday. They were attempting to fly into Los Angeles and were instead diverted to San Francisco after overnighting there. They learned that they would not be able to fly on to Los Angeles today, so they boarded buses and made the 8-hour drive to Los Angeles. They were the lucky ones because now at least they are in their final destination. Others were not so lucky. We encountered a number of passengers stranded here at LAX, including one man that we met who is from Nutley, New Jersey.
Nutley's about 5 miles from Manhattan. My home actually had a view of the Trade Center. We don't have the view anymore. Somebody came in and took it away. And my family, all the families back here are very upset. I'm sure 6 degrees removed, we know someone who knows someone who is no longer with us because what these people did to the United States. And I just really miss them. I want to get back to my family to be with them, going through what they're going through.
There were heartwarming stories as well of people pulling together. We met up with a group of 4 stranded passengers. The airlines they flew on didn't provide them with accommodations, although one kind employee from Southwest Airlines did provide them with some food and drink. Last night, however, they had to pool their resources together, and they found a motel room here locally. 4 strangers brought together by an awful circumstance, now friends who've camped in together at a motel.
She snores.
You sort of see. It was fine. I mean, you tried, the other girl and I, after he left, I go, what are we doing? I mean, we don't know who's who, if they're murders or whatever, but we got to trust our instincts and stay together, try to help each other.
People trying to keep a sense of humor and trying to pull together under a difficult circumstance. Tomorrow, some flights, some of the diverted international flights that were diverted to Canada are expected to arrive here at Los Angeles, possibly as early as 8 or 9 tomorrow morning here local time in California. Airport officials say they still don't know yet, however, if any planes will be allowed to depart with any of the stranded passengers here in Los Angeles. Jim.
One of the things that you have to notice from all of this, Frank, is the attitude of the passengers. There is not the anger that you would probably expect in this situation were it any other reason.
Yeah, and we noticed that yesterday. People were very patiently waiting in line. When people have their flights canceled, often you see frayed nerves, you see people yelling at some of the airline employees. Didn't see that at all yesterday. People were simply patiently waiting. They knew the circumstances, they knew why they were in this position, and they were very patient about it. Today we did see people getting a little more anxious about the situation because of information that was suggesting that they should be here at a certain time, then later, no, you don't need to be here because the flights aren't taking off. So we might start to see a little more frustration, but in general, I would agree with you, Jim, that people were very patient. It was not the normal sort of passenger who's very upset about having their flights canceled.
All right, Frank Buckley reporting to us there live from Los Angeles International Airport. Colleen.
And ditto, Jim, for people who've seen schools closed, other events canceled in their communities, people being very patient about it. Also, many major events around the world are being canceled or postponed in the aftermath of these attacks. The United Nations General Assembly decided Wednesday to put off next week's Children's Summit in New York. And officials at the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank say they may cancel their annual meeting. That's set for the end of this month in Washington. Sweden is calling off this weekend's summit of leaders from 14 nations. Even baseball, sport long considered the ultimate U.S. pastime, is on hold. All major league games set for Wednesday have been canceled.
Well, people all around the world, some of them watching this broadcast, all trying to deal with the grief stemming from the attacks. After all, there are many international victims here. I think Britain is expecting maybe as many as 200. Japan also looking at perhaps a high death toll coming out of this.
Yeah, that's right. Some 46 countries have had offices in that World Trade Center. It's especially hard, though, for Americans living abroad as well. Jim Bitterman has more now from Paris.
4,000 miles and an ocean away, worshippers in these distant pews were in no less shock than if they had been looking on from the streets of Lower Manhattan. In this globalized world with its globalized terror, you can be an American in Paris and be just as grief-stricken. Churchmen knew people came to grieve together and used the moment to warn against letting the wrong emotions carry the day.
Yes, we need to go find these people, and we need to deal with them with justice, not out of mindless vengeance and hatred to repay them, but because we, Americans, we don't live like that.
In the end, it was more than just the shared empathy Americans do. Those whose lives led them to Paris are often exactly the sort of people who know New York, who know Washington, and fear for friends left behind. Expatriated, but still patriots, some of whom believe their homeland has been too disengaged from world affairs.
I really hope that it brings us out of isolation. You cannot make peace worldwide. You cannot have peoples living together if they don't communicate. And the only way to do that is to come out of isolation and work together.
The priest at the Episcopal Cathedral here remembered the words of Douglas MacArthur at the end of World War II. If we will not devise a more equitable system than war, the general said, Armageddon will be at our doors. But the words that echoed longest after the prayer service was over were the ones that came at the very end. Words most in the church had learned from childhood, but in a now and forever less innocent world, words whose meaning will never be quite the same. Jim Bitterman, CNN, Paris.
You know, Jim, we've seen so much emotion around the globe on this event. We've seen it in British Prime Minister Tony Blair, Russian President Vladimir Putin. We've seen it in just people who live in countries where they face terrorism, understanding this perhaps on a level that the rest of us just don't.
And let's pause for a minute. Let's take a look at some of the acts that were made around the world in response to all of this, and listen really to what people had to say.
I can only say that all those who have lost their lives, and indeed those who are related and have loved ones who have lost their lives, are very much in my thoughts and prayers.
I react to the families hearing the news, how their lives are never going to be the same. And I feel their pain. I saw that building collapse and I broke down in tears. I was just sobbing because this is pain. This is human suffering.
We are here to lay some wreaths, some flowers, and to also show our sympathy in action so that the American people understand that the Palestinians are not their enemy.